Hey guys, tonight we start an exploration into one of history's most amazing shifts. It's the tale of an unknown who rose to become the world's most influential woman. But here's what your teachers skipped. She wasn't meant to succeed. She wasn't Russian at all. She was a poor German teen with no troops, no funds, and a spouse who hated her. Still, she somehow outwitted a whole empire. And the method she used? That's the detail that'll have you thinking late into the night. So, before we jump into this amazing narrative together, I have a quick request. If you like discovering history's overlooked realities with me, the controversies, the tactics, the details missing from your books, go ahead and tap that subscribe button, like this video if it hooks you. And really, leave a comment sharing where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Are you tucked in bed in California, lounging on a sofa in London? I truly enjoy reading your stories. And hey, lower the lights, settle in, perhaps switch on a fan for some soft background sound, and let's travel back in time. Ready? Let's get started. April 21st, 1729. A baby girl arrived in a cold castle in Stettin, a town you might not know in what's now Poland, but was Prussia back then. Her name was Sophie, not Catherine. Sophie. And if you'd glimpsed that infant that day, if you'd noticed her family's rundown property and bare coffers, you'd have scoffed at the notion that she'd one day command the planet's biggest empire. Because here's the key point. Sophie's family had nobility and title alone. They held the rank, yes. Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst. It sounds grand, doesn't it? But they were poor. Not the kind where you cut back for a month. Truly destitute. The sort of aristocratic household that had to pick between warming the castle or paying the staff. Sophie's mother, Princess Johanna, was the sole reason they stayed solvent. She had ties, strong lineage, the type of ancestry that counted in 18th century Europe, and Johanna was driven, fiercely so. She viewed her daughter, this smart, inquisitive young girl, and saw one element, a tool for negotiation, an escape route, a chance at fortune. Now, picture yourself as Sophie. You're 14 years old, 14. You speak French and German fluently. You've been trained in faith, music, history, everything a true princess ought to master. But you've also heard repeatedly that your family depends on you marrying advantageously, not for romance, not for joy, but for endurance. The weight on this teen's back was huge, and then an invitation comes that alters it all. Empress Elizabeth of Russia seeks a bride for her nephew, the successor to the Russian crown. His name is Peter, and Johanna sees this as their opportunity, their single chance. So in January 1744, during the harsh winter, 15-year-old Sophie and her mother board a carriage and embark on the lengthy, icy trip to Russia. Sophie had no clue she'd never return to her birthplace. Never. For the next 52 years of her life, she wouldn't go back to Germany once. Consider that. 15 years old, abandoning all you've known, traveling to a strange land where you can't speak the tongue, to wed a boy you've never encountered, to join a dynasty that might eliminate you for a misstep. And when Sophie finally encountered Peter, it was a mess. She later noted in her memoirs, and yes, she penned memoirs, we'll cover that she found him utterly repulsive. Her exact term, detestable. He was wan, unwell, fixated on toy soldiers, and had a drinking issue at 16 years old. 16. They lived at distant parts of the palace. She couldn't tolerate him. But this is where it becomes compelling, where you begin to notice the genius emerging in this young woman's thoughts. Because Sophie grasped something vital. She couldn't alter who Peter was, but she could fully shape who she turned into. And so she chose that evening, a choice that would shape her whole existence. She would become more Russian than the natives. Consider the boldness of that. This German teen resolved to surpass everyone at court in Russianness, even the true Russians, and she began right away. First, she switched from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy. She adopted a new name, Catherine, not Sophia, the Russian form of Sophie, Catherine Yekaterina Alexeyevna. She delved into the Orthodox religion with a fervor that stunned all. But it was the language that truly displayed her resolve. Catherine didn't merely pick up Russian, she fixated on it. And here's the fact that stuns me each time. She'd rise in the dead of night during the bitter Russian winter, pace barefoot on her room's chilly floor, and rehearse Russian sounds, barefoot in Russian winter. Do you grasp how freezing that is? She repeated this night after night, walking to and fro, murmuring Russian phrases to herself in the shadows. And what occurred? She caught pneumonia, almost perished from it in 1744. The girl nearly ended her life learning Russian, but did she quit? No, she became even sicker. Got pleurisy along with the pneumonia. The treatment then was bloodletting. They'd slice you and drain blood, believing it balanced the humors. Old-fashioned methods. Catherine underwent 4 bloodletting procedures in one day. 4. And once she healed, what did she do? She returned to studying even more intensely. Now, let's discuss Empress Elizabeth, as she's essential to this tale. Elizabeth was the one who'd selected Sophie to wed Peter. But Elizabeth had a huge issue. Peter and Catherine weren't making an heir, and in a monarchy, that's not merely an issue. It's a disaster. It's your entire validity. So Elizabeth began posing awkward questions. And soon, the humiliating reality emerged. Peter didn't know how to, perform as a spouse. I'm serious. The heir to the Russian throne, 17 years old, didn't grasp the fundamentals of marital intimacy. Elizabeth's fix? She introduced a young widow to instruct Peter. Yes, that's correct. They brought in another woman to teach the future emperor how to be close with his wife. And evidently Peter was an eager learner because 9 years after their wedding, 9 years of delay, of shame, of court whispers about Catherine's inability to bear an heir, she finally conceived. On October the 1st, 1754, Catherine delivered a son. They called him Paul. He was Russia's heir, the future emperor. All rejoiced. But here's the secret Catherine disclosed later, a secret that would shadow Russian history. She asserted Paul wasn't Peter's child. She said the father was Sergei Saltykov, a dashing young court officer, her paramour, which would render the whole Romanov lineage from then on invalid. Now, historians debate this. Some believe she spoke truthfully. Others think she invented it later to discredit Paul during their rift. And here's the amusing aspect, the proof against Catherine's assertion. Paul matured resembling Peter exactly, stocky, unattractive, somewhat clumsy, while Catherine and Sergei were both said to be stunning. So essentially, historians refuted this scandal via 18th century attractiveness ratings. If that doesn't amuse you, I'm not sure what will. But consider what those 9 years must have felt like for Catherine. 9 years of apparent failure, 9 years of murmurs, of Empress Elizabeth's letdown, of fearing she'd be dismissed, divorced, shamed. And she couldn't control Peter, couldn't repair him, couldn't make him change. But what she could manage was herself, her learning, her connections, her image. And so while Peter toyed with soldiers and drank, Catherine read. She read widely. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Tacitus. She studied works on philosophy, authority, governance. She wasn't only mastering Russian speech and customs, She was learning how empires operated, how influence truly worked, and she was forging ties deliberately, strategically with key figures, the military leaders, the aristocratic houses, the ones who truly managed Russia. See, here's what captivates me about this phase of Catherine's life, those initial years in Russia prior to seizing power. She was in a situation most would deem hopeless. Born abroad, no support network, wed to a fool, always observed and critiqued. Most in her spot would have surrendered, or at least settled for being an ornamental princess. But Catherine, she was strategizing chess while others played checkers. She grasped something deep about authority. It's not about your initial spot. It's about endurance, planning, and preparedness when opportunity strikes. Because here's the true insight from this segment of Catherine's story, the part overlooked in history lessons. Sometimes the strongest action is to wait. Not idle waiting, active waiting, studying, constructing, readying. Catherine devoted nearly 18 years to preparation, 18 years of embarrassment, of condescension, of seeing her husband humiliate himself in her. And she could have rebelled, complained, sought fairer treatment. But she didn't. She smiled, learned, formed alliances, and waited. And that endurance, that deliberate strategic endurance, was poised to yield spectacular results. Because in 1762, Peter would ascend as emperor, and his rule would endure precisely 6 months before Catherine acted. But how does a woman born abroad with no forces topple Russia's emperor? How does she persuade Europe's mightiest army to back her over their legitimate ruler? Well, that's where our narrative turns truly engaging, and that's precisely what we'll examine next. Because the overthrow Catherine executed, the swiftness, the accuracy, the pure daring, it's one of the cleverest seizures of authority in history. So stick around because you won't believe the next part. So, you're likely curious, what was it really like being wed to Peter? We've mentioned him being repulsive, the toy soldiers, his alcohol. But let me sketch a fuller image because the truth was far stranger and more tragic than you might expect. Imagine this. You're Catherine, now in your 20s. You've done all the right things. You've mastered Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, born an heir, followed every rule, and your prize? Watching your husband play with dolls. Seriously. Peter owned a huge assortment of toy soldiers, hundreds, perhaps thousands, and it wasn't casual interest. He was consumed. He'd devote full days to positioning them in combat setups on tables in his chambers, orchestrating detailed war scenarios. A mature man, Russia's future emperor, engaging with figurines. But here's where it becomes genuinely odd. Peter had a dog, a small rat terrier, and one day, this dog did typical dog things. It toppled some of Peter's toy soldiers amid one of his pretend battles, and Peter, the Russian throne's heir, tried the dog in court, a real trial. He arranged a tiny court-martial with a small judge and jury of toys. He deemed the dog guilty of betrayal and ordered it hanged a dog for disturbing toys. Can you picture being Catherine, observing this, seeing your husband kill a pet for ruining his game time, and having to maintain composure because disrespecting the Grand Duke at Russian court could lead to banishment or worse? But Peter's fixation on toy soldiers paled next to his adoration of Frederick the Great of Prussia. And I need you to grasp how troublesome this was. Russia and Prussia were foes. They'd battled for years in the 7 Years' War. Russian troops died combating Prussian forces. And Peter? Peter maintained a shrine to Frederick in his quarters. Paintings, portraits, statues. He discussed Frederick as others spoke of deities. He analyzed every fight Frederick waged. He aspired to be Frederick. He wore Prussian army outfits at the Russian court. Do you spot the issue? Catherine would later describe watching Peter train his servants like Prussian troops, forcing them to parade hallways for hours, yelling at them in German. And she had to remain there as Russia's Grand Duchess, observing her husband role-play as the adversary while actual Russian soldiers perished on real fields. The shame was ongoing, unyielding, and not merely private. The whole court witnessed it. Everyone knew. Now, I want to stop here because we should discuss what this type of marriage does to someone mentally. Catherine was stuck, fully trapped. In the 18th century, royalty had no real divorce, especially not for a foreign wife tasked with heirs. She couldn't depart, couldn't protest openly, couldn't even share with most because her words could be twisted against her. She was in a luxurious prison with a man-child who switched between neglecting her and shaming her. And the loneliness was deep. Think on it. She was far from home in a nation where she'd always be viewed as outsider, married to a man who didn't care for her and whom she couldn't care for. Empress Elizabeth monitored her constantly, doubting her every action. Other courtiers regarded her as foreigner. She had to be cautious about friends, words, behavior. One error, and she could forfeit all. So what did Catherine do? She created an escape no one could remove. She read. And not casual reading. This was a structured self-teaching regimen that would exhaust today's grad students just considering it. While Peter played toys, Catherine read Plato, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Tacitus. She explored political thought, history, law, science. She read in French, German, and more in Russian. She was basically granting herself a college degree in governance and state affairs. And here's what touches me about this. Reading wasn't only instructional for Catherine, it was lifeline. Each book was an opening from her cage. Each philosophical work was a dialogue with intellect superior to any at Russian court. When she absorbed Voltaire's concepts on enlightened rule, when she examined Montesquieu's ideas on power division, she wasn't merely learning theories. She was envisioning a new Russia, a Russia she might eventually guide, where logic and advancement mattered more than toy soldiers and Prussia admiration. There's this letter she penned much later, after becoming empress, where she stated, "I arrived in Russia without biases. I was eager to accept what I was told and do what was required." But then she added something revealing. But the complete emptiness I was left in, and my solitude prompted me to watch, to learn, and to gain from every situation. Complete emptiness. That's how she depicted her marriage, void. But she transformed that void into chance. Now let's contrast this with other historical political unions, because it helps grasp how uniquely awful Catherine's circumstance was. Take Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI of France, also arranged, also had early bedroom issues, also ended poorly. But Louis, despite his shortcomings, wasn't deliberately mean to Marie Antoinette. He was awkward and detached, yes, but not cruel. Or consider Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. That marriage collapsed, but Eleanor obtained an annulment and wed Henry II, becoming one of medieval Europe's most influential women. She had options in time. But Catherine, she had a distinct challenge. She had a husband who wasn't merely inept, but actively harmful. Peter didn't ignore Russia's needs. He undermined them. He didn't fail to love Catherine. He appeared to relish shaming her. There's this event that captures it. At a dinner gathering before the full court, Peter labeled Catherine a fool, aloud at the table. He got intoxicated as usual and began ridiculing her smarts in front of all. And Catherine had to sit, smile, act unhurt because displaying vulnerability at Russian court was risky. Do you know what that does to someone? being called dumb publicly when you're the room's smartest, when you've studied political philosophy while your husband toys around. It breeds this intriguing mix of fury and drive, and you can see it in how Catherine began to proceed, gradually, cautiously. She started nurturing bonds with important people, military officers weary of war losses due to Peter's pro-Prussia leanings, nobles who saw Peter's immaturity and feared for Russia's future, court functionaries who saw Catherine's wit even if they couldn't say so openly. She wasn't scheming a coup, not yet, but she was constructing a web, a base, because Catherine comprehended something Peter never did. Power in Russia didn't stem from the crown. It came from the army, the nobility, and the Orthodox Church. And Peter was estranging all three. The army despised him for his Prussia fandom. The nobility was anxious because he was erratic and threatened their rights. The Church was wary because he discussed Protestant notions and mocked Orthodox practices. Peter was methodically eroding every support of the Russian throne without realizing it. Meanwhile, Catherine did the reverse. She attended Orthodox ceremonies diligently. She learned and honored Russian traditions. She respected the nobility. She befriended military officers' spouses. She was becoming Russian in a manner Peter, born nearer to Russia than Catherine, never achieved. And here's the contemporary parallel that's so pertinent. How often have you witnessed someone in a role they didn't merit? Someone inept and conceited, making everyone miserable. Maybe a boss promoted via connections. Maybe a coworker claiming others' credit. Maybe a leader prioritizing loyalty over skill. Peter was that at the ultimate level, and Catherine was the skilled one who had to grin and feign ignorance. But Catherine was gaining a vital lesson in these years of shame. She was learning precisely what not to do. Every foolish choice Peter made, every tie he severed, every ally he lost, she noted. Mental notes. She was studying authority by observing spectacular failure. There's this idea in leadership studies called learning from bad examples. Sometimes the top instructor is seeing someone botch everything, and Peter was a seminar in losing an empire. He showed Catherine via his errors how delicate power is, how it relies on bonds, on image, on knowing when to assert and when to subtlety. Peter had the title, the crown, the command, but no clue how to employ power. And Catherine learned that possessing power and using it are entirely separate. By 1761, matters were nearing crisis. Empress Elizabeth was fading. Everyone knew, and everyone also knew Peter's ascension would bring drastic shifts, not positive ones. Catherine sensed it. The strain, the concern, the glances at Peter, then at her, as if assessing, as if pondering, as if questioning silently. Is there another option? Then, in January 1762, Elizabeth passed. Peter became Emperor Peter III of Russia, and Catherine's deepest fears materialized instantly, because now Peter held supreme authority, and he was about to wield it in ways that stunned the empire and gave Catherine the opening she'd prepared for, perhaps subconsciously, for 18 years. But we'll delve into exactly how that unfolded, how Peter's 6-month rule turned into a textbook on political self-sabotage, and how Catherine converted her biggest weakness, being undervalued, into her strongest asset. January 1762, Peter III was at last emperor. And know what his initial formal action was. Within days of becoming Russia's most powerful man, he halted the war with Prussia, just like that. Russia had fought Prussia for 7 years. Thousands of Russian soldiers had perished. Russia was winning. They'd seized Berlin. Prussian King Frederick the Great was near defeat. Russia was set to dominate Europe, and Peter surrendered it all for zilch. Let me clarify the implications. Russia pulled back from all captured lands. Peter restored everything Russia had gained. He offered Frederick 12,000 Russian troops to battle Austria, Russia's partner. He basically flipped sides mid-war. Imagine being a Russian commander who'd just taken enemy ground, lost men under you, and then your new emperor orders you to return it all and fight for the foe. How would that feel? Frederick the Great himself couldn't fathom his fortune. He'd been prepared to yield. His funds were depleted, his forces exhausted. Prussia was collapsing. Then Peter rescued him. Frederick later remarked, and this is an actual quote, "Peter allowed himself to be dethroned like a child being sent to bed. Even the man Peter idolized thought he was pitiful." But here's what Peter didn't grasp, what he couldn't grasp because he'd spent life toying instead of studying power. In Russia, the military was paramount. The army installed the Romanovs. The army sustained them. And Peter had just insulted every officer, every soldier, every family who'd lost someone in that war. He'd rendered their losses meaningless for his infatuation with Frederick the Great. Catherine observed this, and she was frightened because she knew what followed. Peter had always resented her, always. She was smarter, more liked, more Russian. And now, with total power, he made clear she wouldn't remain empress. He spoke openly of divorcing her, marrying his mistress Elizabeth Vorontsova, sending Catherine to a nunnery or worse. Courtiers reported Peter shaming Catherine at meals, making her toast his mistress, mocking her before foreign envoys. He wasn't just harsh, he was publicly dismantling her status. And Catherine knew that once he formally divorced or confined her, she'd have no safeguard, no future. She might even suffer an accident. It occurred often in royal courts. Inconvenient folks vanished. So Catherine made a decision, her life's riskiest. She began actively forming a plot, no longer just ties, planning a true coup, an emperor's overthrow, which if exposed meant death, not exile, not jail, execution, likely a grim one. That was failure's cost. But she had true allies now, and the most vital were the Orlov brothers, Grigory, Alexei, and their 3 siblings. 5 brothers, all military officers, all linked, all devoted to Catherine. And Grigory Orlov wasn't merely an ally. He was Catherine's lover. Their affair began in 1760, while Elizabeth lived, and Catherine had birthed his son Alexei in April 1762. She'd concealed the pregnancy, feigned sickness, and had a faithful servant ignite his home across town as diversion so she could deliver secretly. Can you fathom the tension, pregnant with your lover's baby while your husband nears emperorship and talks divorce? But Grigory Orlov was beyond a romantic companion. He was a soldier's hero. He'd battled in the 7 Years' War, wounded repeatedly, known for courage and loyalty, and his brothers held similar sway in the military. If the Orlovs backed you, you had the army or a big chunk. The conspiracy expanded gradually. Catherine was cautious, so cautious. They couldn't rush or include too many. Each new member was a risk, someone who might falter, betray, confide wrongly. They required the Izmailovsky Regiment, an elite guard unit. They needed the Semenovsky Regiment. They needed key nobles' backing, and they needed perfect timing. Because here's the essence of coups, true across history. From ancient Rome to recent uprisings, the chance window is usually small. You must act when your foe is weak, but before they notice. Too soon, insufficient support. Too late, they've fortified. Timing must be flawless. And Peter kept providing openings. He alienated the Orthodox Church by ridiculing their customs and proposing reforms that seemed Protestant. He released nobility from required state duty, which seemed positive, but unsettled them by altering the basic social agreement. He discussed seizing church properties. He strutted in Prussian uniforms. Each choice angered someone new, made someone new open to options. By summer 1762, the plot was set. They had military backing. They had the scheme. They awaited the ideal moment. Then, on July 8th night, all went awry. A conspirator, Captain Pasek, was detained. Someone had spoken or suspected, and Peter's agents seized him. Suddenly, the plot risked exposure. Within hours, Pasek would face questioning. He might reveal. He might name names. The whole plan could collapse. Time was up. Catherine was at Peterhof, a palace near St. Petersburg. Peter was at Oranienbaum, another palace, drinking and reveling with his Holstein associates. And at 6 a.m. on July 9th, Alexei Orlov rushed into Catherine's bedroom and roused her with words that must have raced her heart. "It's time. You must come immediately. Pause on that instant. You're Catherine. You've planned for months. Yes, but you anticipated more time, more setup, and now it's now, this morning. Either you become empress or perish attempting. No compromise, no retreat." She dressed. She entered a carriage with Alexei Orlov, and they sped to St. Petersburg, to the Izmailovsky Regiment barracks. This was the bet. If soldiers backed Peter, Catherine would be arrested soon and likely executed by evening. If they backed her, then all shifted. They reached the barracks. Catherine exited the carriage and did something clever. She didn't order. She didn't dictate. She requested. She approached the soldiers and said plainly, "They want to kill me. Will you safeguard me?" Consider the mindset of that. She didn't say, "I'm overthrowing the emperor." She said, "I need protection." She placed the ethical burden on the soldiers, and it succeeded. A priest advanced and blessed her. The soldiers knelt. They pledged loyalty, one regiment. Then they marched to the Semenovsky barracks. Those soldiers joined. Then the Preobrazhensky regiment. Within hours, Catherine had 14,000 troops supporting her. And here's what truly intrigues me about this coup. It was bloodless so far, not one shot. Peter was at Oranienbaum, oblivious. He thought he remained emperor. He awoke that morning plotting against his bothersome wife, and by noon he had no empire. Catherine entered St. Petersburg leading the army. She went to Kazan Cathedral where clergy awaited. They declared her empress and sole ruler of Russia, not regent, not co-ruler, sole ruler, Catherine II. And the crowd erupted. People celebrated in streets because here's the point. Peter had ruled 6 months, and all loathed him, all. Soldiers hated him for betrayal, church for mockery, nobles for erratic ways. Common folk saw him as alien and feeble. Catherine, the German princess, was somehow more Russian than the Russia-born emperor. How? Because she'd spent 18 years making it so. 18 years mastering language, practicing faith, honoring traditions, building bonds. She'd become Russian by pure determination and effort, and now Russia chose her. Peter, meanwhile, finally heard, and his reaction was so weak it'd be comical, if not tragic. He panicked, totally crumbled. He tried rallying troops, but none came. He tried bargaining, offering shared power with Catherine. She declined. He tried escaping to Prussia, but couldn't arrange it. And finally, on July 9th, the day Catherine seized power, Peter signed abdication papers. He relinquished the throne. After 6 months without resistance, Frederick the Great, the man Peter worshipped lifelong, the one he rescued from loss, heard and made that quote about Peter being dethroned like a child sent to bed. Even Frederick, who gained from Peter's ineptitude, found him laughable. Now let's step back and examine why this coup worked when many historical ones failed disastrously. Because it's not only about troops. Many failed coups had military aid. It's not just the ruler's unpopularity. Many unpopular rulers kept thrones. So what differed? First, Catherine had legitimacy. She was heir Paul's mother. She could claim acting for him as regent. That counted. Second, she was patient. 18 years preparing, forging ties slowly, carefully, no hasty moves. Third, she acted decisively when time came, no delay on July 9th. Fourth, she grasped Russian culture as Peter never did. She gave people a ruler respecting Russia. And fifth, most crucially, Peter had isolated himself so fully that in crisis he had no one. Catherine had all. There's a lesson on power beyond 18th century Russia. Power isn't title or crown or position. It's bonds, networks, trust, validity. You can have all formal authority, but if people don't follow, you have zero. And Peter had zero, while Catherine, with no formal authority, had all. But here's where the tale darkens. Because Catherine was now empress. Yes, the coup was bloodless and triumphant. Yes, but there was a major issue. Peter lived, and while alive, he was a possible focus for opposition, a valid alternative, someone Catherine's foes could use to contest her. And 8 days post-coup, Peter III died in highly dubious circumstances, and the question shadowing Catherine's rule was straightforward. Did she command his killing? Did she know? And what truly transpired in that room where the ex-emperor breathed last? July 17th, 1762, 8 days after Catherine's ascent. And that day, in a modest palace called Ropsha, about 30 miles from St. Petersburg, former Emperor Peter III passed. He was 34. The official reason, hemorrhoidal colic, an 18th century term for hemorrhoid complications, and if you buy that, I've got a bridge in Sanitsa. Petersburg for sale. Let me guide you through what we know. After Peter's abdication on July 9th, Catherine had him moved to Ropsha Palace. It was remote, secure, easy to watch. Peter was held there under what we'd kindly call house arrest, and his guards, Alexei Orlov and his men. Alexei, recall, was brother to Grigory Orlov, Catherine's lover and coup helper. So we're not discussing neutral guards. We have a letter, a real historical record. Alexei Orlov wrote it to Catherine on July 17th, and it survives. Let me share part because the wording is chilling. Little mother, merciful sovereign, how can I describe what occurred? You won't trust your loyal servant, but before God, I'll tell the truth. Little mother, I'm prepared for death, but I don't know how this mishap happened. We are doomed if you show no mercy. Read that again. I don't know how this mishap happened. What does that mean? He describes Peter clashing with other guards at dinner and how they tried separating them. But somehow Peter died. Just somehow an accident, he insists, a dreadful accident. But here's what makes it dubious. Alexei Orlov was a soldier, trained officer, 7 years war survivor. And we're to believe he couldn't manage one drunk ex-emperor and a few guards? That it accidentally led to death? Come on. The official autopsy cited hemorrhoidal colic with intense inflammation causing apoplexy. Apoplexy meant strokes then. But later historians said this diagnosis is nonsense medically. Hemorrhoids don't cause strokes in healthy 34-year-olds, not in 8 days. What does? Poison, strangulation, head trauma, those. But we'll never know precisely what happened there, because all present had reason to lie. What we know? Peter was alive July 9th, dead July 17th, guarded by Catherine's loyalists, and Catherine became Russia's unchallenged ruler the instant he died. Now the big query. Did Catherine know it had happened? Did she order it? And this is where it gets mentally intricate, because we must consider plausible deniability. Catherine was clever, likely Russia's smartest, and she'd know keeping Peter alive was risky, but killing him was too. It stained her legitimacy forever. There's a political science idea called working toward the leader. It means underlings pleasing their boss do what the boss wants without direct orders. They predict desires and act. Henry II of England did this with Thomas Becket. Henry griped about Becket, said something like, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights took it as command and killed Becket. Henry claimed he never intended that. Maybe true, maybe not. But the knights believed they fulfilled his wish. Did something similar occur with Catherine and Peter? Did the Orlov brothers think they helped Catherine? Solved an issue she couldn't request publicly? We lack proof Catherine gave explicit command, but also lack proof she didn't. And Alexei Orlov writing that defensive, anxious letter suggests he knew it looked terrible. What we have is Catherine's response on learning, and it's recorded. "My glory is ruined. Posterity will never forgive me." Not how awful, not who did this, but my glory is ruined. As if she instantly grasped this death, whatever her role, would define history's view of her. And she was correct. We're still discussing it 260 years on. Think what that reveals. Catherine considered her legacy right after her husband's death. Not sorrow, not justice, but appearance, which says something about Catherine. She always thought ahead, always calculated. That's what made her a superb ruler. But it also prompts wonder. How much did she calculate Peter's death? Let me provide context by comparing to other dubious royal deaths. Edward II of England, deposed 1327, reportedly died mysteriously in Berkeley Castle. Rumor, murdered gruesomely with a hot poker. Edward V and brother, princes in the Tower, vanished 1483, likely killed on Richard III's orders. Paul I, Catherine's son, murdered 1801 in a coup his son Alexander likely knew of beforehand. Dubious royal deaths are nearly monarchic tradition. But here's what sets Peter's apart. In most, the killing was politically essential, thus justifiable to perpetrators. Princes in Tower were rival claimants. Edward II deposed but restorable. Paul was erratic, dangerous, but Peter had abdicated, signed papers, no longer emperor, just a sad, pathetic ex-ruler in a palace. Killing him wasn't strictly needed. It was preventive, unless viewed differently. What if Peter hadn't accepted deposition? What if he plotted even in those 8 days? What if he contacted Frederick the Great or loyalists? We know Frederick saw Peter as weak, but Prussia gained from Peter over Catherine. What if a restoration plot existed and Orlovs discovered it? I'm not claiming that happened. I'm saying we don't know. And that uncertainty haunts. Because Catherine ruled 34 more years, became one of Russia's finest rulers, expanded empire, updated nation, supported arts, corresponded with thinkers, became Catherine the Great. But that shadow lingered, the shadow of July 17th, 1762. And you wonder, did it trouble her? Later letters show defensiveness. She insists in memoirs Peter's death was unforeseen, that she planned comfortable confinement, but she doesn't probe, punish, or publicly note suspicions. She moves forward, which could mean innocence, knowing pursuit worsened it, or guilt, wanting it buried. Here's another view. The mental cost. Suppose Catherine didn't order Peter's death, but suspected Orlovs did it for her. How process that? You're indebted to these men for enthroning you. Grigory Orlov is your lover, child's father. His brother may have murdered to secure you. Punish, thank, pretend ignorance. What is that to your spirit? There's a harshness to power we sometimes overlook in history texts. We see dates, battles, pacts, feats. We view Catherine the Great as enlightened autocrat bringing culture and advance to Russia. But we forget her power's base was violence, not just Peter's death. We'll discuss later how she quashed peasant uprisings, wars fought, people who suffered under her. But it began here with a too convenient palace death. Now compare Catherine's spot to other leaders gaining power questionably. Augustus Caesar, in Julius Caesar's killing conspiracy, fought civil war, became first Roman emperor, brought Rome peace and wealth, but on betrayal and blood. Or Queen Elizabeth of Fern of England. She didn't order Mary Queen of Scots' execution personally. Signed warrant, yes, but claimed she never meant execution. Plausible deniability again, and Elizabeth is one of England's top monarchs. The query, do ends justify means? If Catherine hadn't seized power, Peter would have kept ruining Russia. He'd give more to Prussia, lose allies, perhaps spark revolts or revolutions. Utilitarian view, removing Peter, even killing, might have been right for Russia. But morally okay? Where's the boundary? And this is where we in the 21st century must be truthful. We don't know what we'd do in Catherine's shoes. It's easy to judge afar, say, I'd never approve murder. But would you? If you'd strived 18 years to survive, build future, and suddenly held power, but your foe lived and could return any time to ruin all, what would you? I'm not saying murder's right. I'm saying moral clarity's easier when your life's safe. Catherine chose or allowed a choice for her, and it gave her the throne but cost something. That my glory is ruined wasn't just reputation. I think it was self-view. Catherine saw herself as enlightened ruler, philosopher queen inspired by Voltaire, reason, progress. And here she was empress via coup and possible murder. The clash between ideals and reality must have been deep, but remarkably, she didn't let it ruin her, didn't descend into guilt, paranoia, or cruelty like some post-violent rulers. Instead, she channeled it. To prove Peter's death, however it occurred, was worthwhile via her feats. She had to be great to justify the price. And maybe that's why she triumphed. Because she must. Because less would have meant that death was pointless. One more point on this. Truth's nature in history. We'll never know exactly July the 17th, 1762. All who knew are gone. Evidence contradictory, incomplete. We can analyze, speculate, guess educatedly, but certainty's lost. And maybe that's the point. Power at this tier exists in shadows and doubts. Truth gets buried, deliberate, or accidental. What survives is narrative, story, legend. And Catherine knew that. She knew narrative control was as vital as army control, perhaps more. So, did Catherine the Great kill her husband? I can't say definitively. What I can say? She gained from his death. His guards were her allies, circumstances dubious, and she never truly sought what happened. Interpret as you will. But remember, Catherine ruled 34 years, and in those, she changed Russia. Whether that change justified bloody start is for each to decide. But no doubt from this dark instant came one of history's most potent reigns. And now the question, how did she wield that power? What did she do once the throne was safe? Because the tale you've heard about Catherine's lovers is likely wrong. The myths, scandals, whispers. There's truth, yes, but it's far more layered and intriguing than gossip implies. Here's something that might shock you. For over 2 centuries, Catherine the Great has been depicted as history's most infamous nymphomaniac. The tales are extreme, insatiable desires, Dozens of lovers, orgies, corruption, and every history lesson, every doc, every pop reference seems to echo these as truth. But let me share real figures and see how the story flips. From 1752 to 1796, that's 44 years, Catherine had 12 romantic ties. 12 over 44 years. Let's calculate. That's one every 3.5 years on average. Most lasted 2 years or more, some a decade. Does that seem like a sex-obsessed fiend, or like someone in sequential committed relationships across her adult years? But here's the twist. While Catherine's 12 partners over 44 years branded her scandalous, her male peers did worse, and no one cared. Louis XV of France had hundreds of mistresses. Hundreds. He had a whole estate, the Parc aux Cerfs, for housing them. Augustus the Strong of Poland claimed over 300 children. 300. And these men are recalled as what? Virile, mighty. Meanwhile, Catherine with her 12 is seen as perverse. Why? I think you know. Because she was female, and worse, a female with authority, and nothing threatens patriarchal order more than a woman with power and sexual independence. So they made her a villain, a warning, a jest, anything to undercut her real feats. But let's discuss what truly went on with these ties, because it's fascinating. Catherine didn't just have lovers, she wove them into her political system. These weren't random flings. They were calculated alliances serving emotional and state needs, and grasping this alters how we view Catherine's rule. Let's begin with Stanisław Poniatowski because his tale is wild and we haven't covered him much. Catherine met him in 1755 when she was 26, and he 23. He was Polish, attractive, refined, multilingual. He served as diplomat in St. Petersburg, and Catherine fell deeply. This wasn't planned politics. This was real passion. She was in a nightmare marriage with Peter, remember? And Stanisław was Peter's opposite, smart, polished, caring. Their affair lasted years. Catherine conceived and bore a daughter, Anna, in December 1757, but the child died after just over a year. Imagine the sorrow, having a baby with your love secretly while wed to a despised man, then losing her. Catherine seldom wrote of Anna, but the quiet says volumes. Now, here's the political brilliance. In 1763, a year after Catherine's ascent, Poland elected a new king. And Catherine spotted chance. She threw Russia's full backing, military and financial, behind Stanisław, her ex-lover, and got him king of Poland. Think on it. She made her former boyfriend a king. Sounds like romance novel stuff, except it happened. But Catherine's aim wasn't romantic. It was tactical. She figured Stanisław would be thankful, faithful, essentially a puppet doing Russia's bidding. She'd control Poland via him. Smart, right? Except it backfired hugely because Stanisław, once king, acted like one. He enacted reforms strengthening Poland's autonomy. He sought escape from Russian sway. He had principles. Who knew? Catherine was enraged, betrayed. She'd given him a throne and he used it against her. So what did she do? Forced his abdication, led the partitions of Poland, literally dividing the nation among Russia, Prussia, Austria. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a European powerhouse, vanished, partly because Catherine's ex wouldn't toe the line. There's something profoundly human here, right? A bond starting in true love, ending in geopolitical ruin. And it shows something key about Catherine. She could detach personal emotions from political need. When Stanisław ceased aiding Russia, their history didn't save him. Harsh, perhaps, but that edge made her effective. Now, let's discuss Grigory Potemkin, because this tie truly shaped Catherine's emotional world. We've mentioned Grigory Orlov, the coup ally, Catherine's lover who aided her ascent. That lasted about 10 years from 1760 to 1772. But when it ended, when Orlov left court in 1772, Catherine briefly took another lover, Alexander Vasilchikov, and by accounts that was dull. Vasilchikov was good-looking but superficial. Catherine wasn't mentally stimulated. It lasted under 2 years. Then, in 1774, Grigory Potemkin entered and all changed. Potemkin wasn't typically handsome. He'd lost an eye in a fight. He was moody, intense, smart, ambitious. But Catherine and Potemkin connected on a level unmatched by her other ties. They were intellectual peers. They debated philosophy, discussed war tactics, argued policy. He challenged her in ways that frustrated and excited her. And here's what historians still argue. Did Catherine secretly wed Potemkin? Hints in letters. They called each other husband and wife privately. Rumors of a secret Orthodox rite, but no solid proof. If they did, it was morganatic, meaning Potemkin wouldn't be emperor, but legally married. Why secret? Because Catherine couldn't have a husband. Her authority stemmed from sole rule. A husband, even morganatic, threatened that. Their bond evolved. Passionate lovers for about 2 years, from 1774 to 1776. But even after physical intimacy ended, they stayed incredibly close. Potemkin became Catherine's top advisor, her governance partner. He led campaigns, annexed Crimea, developed Southlands, and Catherine trusted him like no other. They wrote constantly, hundreds of letters, and the closeness in those is striking. Even post-intimacy, they were emotionally linked. There's one letter where Potemkin is on campaign, and Catherine writes, "I'm bored without you. I wander these rooms and see only walls." This is Russia's Empress, world's most powerful woman, admitting loneliness, missing him. It's vulnerable in a way Catherine rarely permitted. Potemkin died in 1791, and Catherine was crushed. She secluded for days, saw no one. When she emerged, she'd aged noticeably. Court said she never fully healed from his loss, and that tells something essential. For all her power, political skill, Catherine was human. She needed connection, companionship, love. The crown didn't shield from heartbreak. Now, post-Potemkin, Catherine had several other lovers, mostly younger men. Alexander Dmitrievich Mamonov was one. He was in his 20s when it started. Catherine in her 50s. And here's where gossip peaked, because society could accept a woman in 20s or 30s with affairs. But a 50s woman with a younger man? Scandalous, repulsive, unnatural, they said. Mamonov eventually loved one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, a 16-year-old, and eloped. And there's a rumor, likely false but spread, that Catherine had the girl whipped in revenge. Reality probably less dramatic. Catherine was hurt, yes, humiliated, sure, but handled with grace. Gave the pair money and estates, sent them from court. Not a vengeful monster's act, but the scandal highlights something larger. The double standard Catherine endured. When older kings took young mistresses, common in history, it was expected, sign of vigor. But Catherine doing equivalent proved depravity, and this double standard was used against her by enemies, especially Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick, recall, gained hugely from Catherine's husband's foolishness. But Catherine was no fool, and Frederick knew. He couldn't beat her politically or militarily, so attacked her reputation. He's the one who said, documented, about Catherine, "A woman is always a woman, and in feminine government the censored has more influence than a firm policy guided by straight reason." Read again. This from one of Europe's top men, criticizing a woman who expanded Russia by 200,000 square miles, modernized government, made Russia European dominant. Essentially, She's female, so ruled by her body. The sexism stuns. And it worked. Those views shaped Catherine's memory for centuries. Even her son Paul, who despised her for reasons, passed a law post-death barring women from Russian throne ascension. Think on it. Catherine ruled successfully 34 years, transformed Russia, and her son's reply was ensuring no woman ever could again. Sexism institutionalized. But here's what intrigues me about Catherine's lover approach. She was open, didn't hide or stash them in separate palaces, brought them to court, gave official roles, acknowledged publicly. Why? Because secrecy breeds weakness. Secrets can expose, blackmail, weaponize. But openness strips harm's power. Plus, giving lovers state positions was strategic. These men were personally loyal, owed positions to her. In ambitious noble court, having people whose success tied to yours was smart. Grigory Orlov became artillery head, Potemkin's southern territory's governor-general. These weren't ceremonial, real power, and holders had incentive for Catherine's success, compared to other female rulers' handling. Elizabeth I of England never wed, no acknowledged lovers, presented as virgin queen. Different tactic, power via purity. But Elizabeth was isolated, no intimate partners, no full trust, died alone amid courtiers plotting succession. Or Maria Theresa of Austria, Catherine's contemporary, married, 16 children, presented as ideal wife, mother, used traditional femininity for legitimacy, worked for her, but limited her, unlike Catherine. Catherine picked a third path, refused pretending no desires or needs, refused hiding humanity. Yes, vulnerable to critique and scandal, but powerful differently. Proof a woman could be ruler and lover, wield political power and enjoy personal joy. Revolutionary, threatening, unacceptable to men wanting women in defined roles. You know what's sad? We still face this. Think how modern female politicians, scrutinized on looks, relationships, families unlike males, sexist language against powerful women, double standards persist, more subtle sometimes. Catherine's reply to gossip and scandal. Kept doing what she wanted, kept lovers, kept promoting them, kept ruling brilliantly, and proved through 34 successful years that misogynistic critics were wrong. A woman could govern with mind and heart, be powerful and passionate, refuse apologizing for humanity. But one scandal about Catherine persists more than others, one tale defining her popular legacy over feats, and that tale involves villages, a Crimea trip, and history's top propaganda success. Because what if I told you one of the most famous things known about Catherine the Great is likely total invention, and the truth reveals something deep about history's writing and who writes it? You've likely heard Potemkin village, used often in politics and business, means facade, impressive surface but fake below. Show to fool someone key. Companies make Potemkin villages for investors, politicians for voters. Phrase so common most forget origins. But I'll tell you, then explain why the story's almost surely false and why it matters. The year 1787. Catherine ruled 25 years. She'd annexed Crimea in 1783, adding vast southern territory, and she wanted to view it, tour these new gains, lands Grigory Potemkin developed and governed. So she planned history's most lavish royal tour. Journey lasted 6 months. Catherine traveled with huge group, foreign ambassadors, courtiers, servants, soldiers, thousands, down Dnieper River on ornate boats, then overland through conquered areas. Meant to display Russia's strength and Potemkin's new Russia's success. And here's where legend begins. Later story. Potemkin knew territories undeveloped, villages poor, people struggling, nothing as grand as promised Catherine. So he allegedly built fake villages along route, hollow fronts, painted canvas on wood frames mimicking buildings, hired peasants to dress nicely and wave happily as Catherine passed. Then, after she left, dismantle and relocate ahead for reuse. Traveling illusion, imperial scale scam. Great story, right? Drama, ambition, showmanship. Fits narrative of Catherine as foolish woman amid manipulative men. Silly empress so easily tricked her lover could build fake villages unnoticed. Makes Catherine dumb, Potemkin schemer, and that's why invented. Because modern historians, scholars studying primary sources, say this almost certainly didn't occur, or at least wildly overstated. Let me explain why. First, who began rumor? Saxon diplomat Georg von Helbig, not on trip, not eyewitness, heard secondhand, wrote 1797 after Catherine and Potemkin dead, unable to respond. Convenient? And von Helbig represented Saxon interests against Russian growth. Motive to fake Russian feats. Second, foreign ambassadors on trip. Austrian Emperor Joseph II there. French ambassador, English envoy. Sophisticated, traveled men. Believe all fooled by painted canvas, none noticed fake buildings, none mentioned in detailed home reports. We have those reports. None note fake villages, none. Third, and this crumbles story, evidence of Potemkin's real builds, archaeological proof construction records, cities existing today. Kherson founded 1778, Mykolaiv 1789, Sevastopol massive naval base, not fake. Real cities with populations, infrastructure, economy, can't fake naval base, can't fake city. So what likely happened? Potemkin probably did route beautification, villages cleaned, painted, decorated for Catherine's visit, best-dressed peasants along path, maybe moved cattle herds visibly. Not huge deception, what we'd call staging today. Every modern politician does it on visits. Clean route, best face, manage visuals. We don't call fraud, we call politics. But Potemkin's foes took that truth kernel and blew into massive lie. And lie stuck. Over 200 years, Potemkin village means elaborate fakery. Most still believe it. Why matter? Reveals historical narratives created and who shapes. Potemkin, brilliant, accomplished, effective, developed vast areas, built cities, modernized infrastructure, created Black Sea Fleet. Real feats. But enemies, Russian court rivals, foreign diplomats against Russian growth, agenda historians created counterstory, turned feats into frauds, made him joke. And since he died 1791, couldn't defend, that version became history. Think the power. Someone does real work, achieves real, yet remembered as fraud because enemies controlled narrative. Sound familiar? Seen in modern politics, someone achieves genuine, opponents spin as fake, theater, illusions. Repeat enough, becomes belief. This 18th century fake news, misinformation, propaganda, worked so well we're still duped centuries later. When I researched this, I thought Potemkin village true because always told so. Only digging actual scholarship realized, wait, probably false. I'd spread lie unknowingly. And here's more interesting. Potemkin village myth serves purpose, undermines Catherine, because if Potemkin fraud and Catherine fell for deception, she incompetent. Foolish woman easily manipulated. Never mind 34-year rule. Never mind 200,000 square miles added. Never mind modernized government, legal system, culture. If fooled by fake villages, not smart, right? See narrative work. Not just Potemkin, about Catherine. Cutting her down, making feats less impressive, her less capable. Same pattern throughout her story. Sexual rumors, murder claims, fake village legend, all to undermine powerful woman. Let me compare. Napoleon Bonaparte lost Russian campaign disastrously, retreated Moscow with army freezing, starving, documented. But remember him for that failure? No. As military genius because narrative focuses victories, brilliance, feats. Failures, footnotes. Catherine won wars, expanded territory, no major loss. But what remembered? Fake villages, sexual scandals, double standard staggering. Now, let's discuss Potemkin's real feats, because that's story worth telling. When Catherine annexed Crimea and South, sparse, underdeveloped, vulnerable. Ottoman threat lingered, needed infrastructure, defense, settlers. Potemkin delivered, founded cities, not fake, real, visitable today. Built Black Sea fleet from scratch. Think, shipyards, naval bases, trained sailors, officers, supplies, can't fake navy. Established farm settlements, encouraged European immigration, built roads, ports, admin buildings, all perfect? No. Some exaggerated in reports? Maybe, but fundamentally fake? No. Historical document, Catherine's 1787 letter to Potemkin during trip, writes how impressed with development, new buildings, thriving settlements, progress. Either Catherine fool, unable to distinguish real from canvas, or saw real development. And all we know, not fool. But here's clever part of Potemkin village myth. Unfalsifiable. Point real cities, infrastructure feats. Response. Built after trip to cover fraud. Point foreign ambassadors, no fake reports? Well, they fooled too. Note no contemporary evidence. Of course, covered well. Conspiracy theory, and like good ones, structured so evidence against explainable. How no probably false. Real events leave traces, contradictions, evidence. Perfect narratives explaining all, no loose ends, usually invented. So why spread successfully? Good story, drama, irony, spectacle. Anecdote people remember, repeat. No Catherine Great, fooled by fake villages? Great party fact, except not fact, legend. But legends often endure more than truth. Lesson on consuming info today. How many stories believe because dramatic? Fit assumptions? Repeated enough by enough? How often check sources, verify, consider narrative beneficiaries? Potemkin village story benefited all, undermining Catherine and Russian growth, made Russia's feats hollow, Catherine gullible, Potemkin corrupt, and as useful narrative for many, spread, became conventional wisdom, and conventional wisdom hard to uproot even wrong. I want you think. What other historical facts might be myths? How many times repeated unheard without check? Not making paranoid on knowledge. Suggest approach history with more skepticism, curiosity on sources, motives, because history not fact collection, story collection. And stories told by people with views, agendas. Winners write history, yes, but propagandists too. Gossips too. Enemies of powerful women wanting size them down. Catherine understood, knew rumors false or exaggerated, but fighting directly often spotlighted. So focused feats, building, creating, expanding, being so competent, lies overwhelmed by reality. Worked some, called Catherine great, not fooled, not fake, but debunking horse rumor 260 years later shows not fully. Misogyny too strong, persistent, useful. So if someone mentions horse rumor at party, correct. Say, no, false, died stroke, ruled Russia 34 years, expanded empire hugely, patronized arts, corresponded Enlightenment philosophers, transformed, adopted country major European power. Facts. Sex scandals propaganda, because we choose stories repeat, decide perpetuate lies or demand truth, and repeating false rumor about Catherine participates sexism creating them, saying powerful women deserve mock, diminish, their feats matter less than gossip. I refuse, and hope after this story you refuse. Catherine Great deserves judgment on actual deeds. Good, bad, progressive, oppressive. Deserves historical accuracy, not slander. Deserves serious as 18th century's top rulers, gender aside, and deserves better than remembered mainly for lies by men unable handle woman, more powerful. But there is one scandal about Catherine that has persisted more than any other. One story that seems to define her legacy in popular culture more than her actual accomplishments. And that story involves villages, a journey to Crimea, and one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. Because what if I told you that one of the most famous things everyone knows about Catherine the Great is probably a complete fabrication, and that the truth of what really happened reveals something profound about how history gets written and who gets to write it? You've probably heard the phrase Potemkin village. It is used all the time in modern politics and business. It means a facade, something that looks impressive on the surface but is fake underneath. A show put on to deceive someone important. Companies create Potemkin villages for investors. Politicians create them for constituents. The phrase is so common that most people do not even know where it comes from. But I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, why the story is almost certainly false and why that matters. The year was 1787. Catherine had been empress for 25 years. She had just annexed Crimea in 1783, adding massive territory to Russia's southern border. And she wanted to see it. She wanted to tour these new conquests, these lands that Grigory Potemkin had been developing and governing. So she organized what might be the most extravagant royal road trip in history. The journey took 6 months. Catherine traveled with a massive entourage, foreign ambassadors, courtiers, servants, soldiers. We're talking about thousands of people. They went down the Dnieper River on decorated boats, then overland through the newly conquered territories. It was meant to showcase Russia's power and the success of Potemkin's development efforts in what they called New Russia. And here is where the legend starts. According to the story that emerged later, Potemkin knew the territories were not really developed. The villages were poor. The people were struggling. Nothing was as impressive as he had promised Catherine it would be. So he supposedly built fake villages along the route, hollow facades, painted canvas stretched over wooden frames to look like buildings. He hired peasants to dress up and wave cheerfully as Catherine passed by. Then, once she moved on, they would dismantle everything and move it further down the route to reuse it. A traveling set piece, a con game on an imperial scale. It is a great story, right? It has everything. Deception, ambition, theatrical flair. And it perfectly fits the narrative of Catherine as a foolish woman surrounded by scheming men who manipulated her. The idiotic empress who was so easily fooled that her lover could literally build fake villages, and she would not notice. It makes Catherine look stupid and Potemkin look like a scheming charlatan. And that is exactly why the story was invented. Because here's the thing. Modern historians, actual academics who have studied the primary sources say this almost certainly never happened. Or at the very least, it has been wildly exaggerated. Let me walk you through why. First, who started this rumor? A Saxon diplomat named Georg von Helbig. He was not even on the trip. He was not an eyewitness. He heard it from someone else and wrote about it years later in 1797, after both Catherine and Potemkin were dead and could not defend themselves. Convenient, right? And von Helbig was representing Saxon interests which were opposed to Russian expansion. He had every motive to make Russian achievements look fake. Second, there were foreign ambassadors on this trip. The Austrian Emperor Joseph II was literally there. The French ambassador, the English envoy. These were sophisticated, educated men who had traveled extensively. Are we really supposed to believe they were all fooled by painted canvas? That not one of them noticed they were looking at fake buildings? That not one of them mentioned it in their detailed reports back home? Because we have those reports, and none of them mention fake villages. None. Third, and this is the part that makes the whole story collapse, we have evidence of what Potemkin actually built. Archaeological evidence, records of construction, cities that still exist today. Kherson founded in 1778, Mykolaiv founded in 1789, Sevastopol, the massive naval base. These were not fake. These were real cities with real populations, real infrastructure, real economic activity. You cannot fake a naval base. You cannot fake a city. So what probably happened? Potemkin likely did some beautification along the route. Maybe he had villages cleaned up, painted, decorated for Catherine's visit. Maybe he had the best-dressed peasants positioned along the route. Maybe he moved some herds of cattle to be visible at strategic points. That is not a massive deception. That is what we would today call staging. It is what every modern politician does when they visit somewhere. Clean up the route, put your best foot forward, manage the optics. We do not call that fraud. We call that politics. But Potemkin's enemies took that grain of truth and exploded it into a massive lie. And the lie stuck. For over 200 years, Potemkin village has meant elaborate fakery, and most people still believe it happened. Why does this matter? Because it reveals how historical narratives get created and who has the power to shape them. Potemkin was brilliant, accomplished, effective. He developed vast territories, built cities, modernized infrastructure, created the Black Sea Fleet. These were real achievements. But his enemies, political rivals at the Russian court, foreign diplomats who opposed Russian expansion, historians with their own agendas, they created a counter-narrative. They turned his accomplishments into cons. They made him a joke. And because he died in 1791 and could not defend himself, that version became history. Think about the power of that. Someone can do real work, accomplish real things, and still be remembered as a fraud because their enemies controlled the narrative. Does that sound familiar? How many times have you seen this happen in modern politics? Someone achieves something genuine, but their opponents spin it as fake, as theater, as smoke and mirrors. And if they repeat it enough times, loudly enough, it becomes what people believe. This is the 18th century version of fake news, misinformation, propaganda, and it worked so well that we're still falling for it over 2 centuries later. When I started researching this section, I believed the Potemkin village story was true because that is what I had always been told. It was only when I dug into the actual historical scholarship that I realized, wait, this is probably false. I had been repeating a lie without even knowing it. And here is where it gets even more interesting. The Potemkin village myth serves a specific purpose. It undermines Catherine because if Potemkin was a fraud and Catherine fell for his deception, then she was incompetent. She was a foolish woman who could be easily manipulated. Never mind that she ruled successfully for 34 years. Never mind that she expanded the empire by 200,000 square miles. Never mind that she modernized Russia's government, legal system, and culture. If she could be fooled by fake villages, then clearly she was not really that smart, was she? You see how the narrative works. It is not just about Potemkin. It is about Catherine. It is about cutting her down, making her achievements seem less impressive, making her seem less capable. And it is the same pattern we have seen throughout her story. The sexualized rumors, the murder accusations, the fake village legend, all designed to undermine a powerful woman. Let me give you a comparison. Napoleon Bonaparte. He lost the Russian campaign catastrophically, retreated from Moscow with his army freezing and starving. That is documented fact. But do we remember him primarily for that failure? No. We remember him as a military genius because the narrative around Napoleon focuses on his victories, his brilliance, his accomplishments. His failures are footnotes. Catherine won wars, expanded territory, never lost a major campaign. But what do we remember? Fake villages and sexual scandals. The double standard is staggering. Now let us talk about what Potemkin actually accomplished, because that is the story that should have been told. When Catherine annexed Crimea and the southern territories, they were sparsely populated, underdeveloped, vulnerable. The Ottoman Empire was still a threat. These territories needed infrastructure, defense, settlers, and Potemkin delivered. He founded cities, not fake ones, real cities that you can visit today. He built the Black Sea Fleet from nothing. Think about what that means. Shipyards, naval bases, trained sailors, officers, supply chains. You cannot fake a navy. He established agricultural settlements, encouraging immigration from across Europe. He built roads, ports, administrative buildings. Was all of this perfect? No. Was some of it probably exaggerated in his reports? Maybe. But was it fundamentally fake? Absolutely not. There is a historical document, a letter from Catherine to Potemkin in 1787 during that famous trip. She writes about how impressed she is with the development she is seeing, about the new buildings, the thriving settlements, the progress. Now, either Catherine was a complete fool who could not tell real buildings from canvas, or she was seeing real development. And everything we know about Catherine suggests she was not a fool. But here's the really clever part of the Potemkin village myth. It is unfalsifiable. If you point out the real cities, the real infrastructure, the real accomplishments, the response is, but those were built after the trip to cover up the fraud. If you point out that foreign ambassadors did not report seeing fakes, the response is, well, they were fooled too. If you note that there is no contemporary evidence for the fake villages, the response is, of course not. They covered it up well. It is a conspiracy theory, and like all good conspiracy theories, it is structured so that any evidence against it can be explained away. That is how you know it is probably false. Real historical events leave traces, contradictions, evidence. Perfect narratives that explain everything and have no loose ends. Those are usually invented. So why did the story spread so successfully? Because it is a good story. It has drama, irony, spectacle. It is the kind of anecdote that people remember and repeat. Did you know Catherine the Great was fooled by fake villages? It is a great dinner party fact, except it is not a fact. It is a legend. But legends often have more staying power than truth. And there is a lesson in that about how we consume information today. How many stories do we believe simply because they are dramatic, because they fit our pre-existing assumptions, because they are repeated often enough by enough people? How often do we check the sources, verify the facts, consider who benefits from a particular narrative? The Potemkin village story benefited everyone who wanted to undermine Catherine and Russian expansion. It made Russia's accomplishments seem hollow. It made Catherine seem gullible. It made Potemkin seem corrupt. And because it was such a useful narrative for so many people, it spread. It became conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom is incredibly hard to dislodge, even when it is wrong. I want you to think about something for a moment. What other historical facts have you learned that might actually be myths? How many times have you repeated something you heard without checking if it is really true? I am not trying to make you paranoid about all knowledge. I'm suggesting that we should approach history with a little more skepticism, a little more curiosity about sources and motives. Because history is not just a collection of facts, it is a collection of stories. And stories are told by people with perspectives and agendas. The winners write history, yes, but so do the propagandists. So do the gossips. So do the enemies of powerful women who want to cut them down to size. Catherine understood this, by the way. She knew the rumors about her were false or exaggerated, but she also knew that fighting them directly often just gave them more attention. So she focused on accomplishments instead, on building, creating, expanding, on being so obviously competent that the lies about her would eventually be overwhelmed by reality. And to some extent, it worked. She is called Catherine the Great after all, not Catherine the Fooled, not Catherine the Fake. But the myths persisted anyway because myths are powerful. They are sticky. They are fun to repeat, and they often reveal more about the people who tell them than about the people they are about. The Potemkin village myth tells us that people in the 18th century and even today would rather believe a powerful woman was incompetent than accept that she was effective, that they would rather believe in elaborate fraud than in genuine accomplishment. What is sad is that Potemkin deserves better too. He was one of the great developers and administrators of the 18th century. He transformed vast territories from frontier lands into productive regions of the empire, and his legacy should be those real cities, those real achievements. Instead, his name became synonymous with fakery. That is the power of propaganda. It can outlive the truth by centuries. But now you know better. Now you know that the Potemkin villages were almost certainly fake news, not fake villages. And maybe that makes you wonder, what else have we been told about Catherine that is not quite true? What other scandals and legends need a second look? Well, I am glad you asked, because we need to talk about Enlightenment and ideals, about the beautiful philosophy Catherine claimed to follow, and the brutal reality of how power actually worked in 18th century Russia, about the paradox at the heart of her reign. How could someone so progressive in theory be so oppressive in practice? Imagine spending 2 years of your life writing the most progressive legal code anyone had ever seen. 526 articles laying out a vision for justice, equality, and rational government. You work on it every single day. You base it on the greatest thinkers of your time, Montesquieu, Beccaria, the philosophes of the French Enlightenment. You pour your heart into creating something that will transform your empire, that will bring reason and humanity to governance. And then you watch it fail completely. Almost nothing you proposed actually gets implemented. That was Catherine's experience with the Nakaz, and it reveals the central tragedy of her reign. Let me take you back to 1764. Catherine has been empress for 2 years. Peter is dead. Her position is secure, and she is ready to actually govern. And she wants to be an enlightened ruler. Not just in theory, in practice. She's been reading Voltaire since she was a teenager. She corresponds with Diderot. She sees herself as part of the Enlightenment, that grand intellectual movement sweeping Europe. And she genuinely believes she can bring those ideals to Russia. So she starts working on what she calls the instruction, the nakaz in Russian. It is supposed to guide a complete reform of Russia's legal system. The existing laws dated from 1649, over a century old, outdated, contradictory, often cruel. Catherine wants to create something new, something based on reason and humanity rather than tradition and fear. She works on this document for 2 years every day, writing, revising, consulting sources, and the result is remarkable. The Nakaz proposes equal protection under law for all persons. It emphasizes preventing crime rather than punishing it harshly. It argues against torture. It suggests that the purpose of punishment should be rehabilitation, not vengeance. It even hints at limiting serfdom, though carefully, because Catherine knows that is dangerous territory. This document was revolutionary for its time. When it was published in 1767, it was widely distributed across Europe and caused a sensation. Voltaire called it the finest monument of the century. French philosophers praised Catherine as the ideal enlightened monarch. She'd written on paper the perfect vision of rational governance, and she was so proud of it. But here is where reality crashed into ideals. In June 1767, Catherine convened the Legislative Commission to actually implement the Nakaz. She brought together representatives from across Russia, nobles, merchants, state peasants, Cossacks, even some non-Russian ethnic groups, over 500 deputies. It was supposed to be this grand democratic exercise, revising Russia's laws according to Enlightenment principles. It was a disaster. The commission met for a year and a half and accomplished almost nothing. Why? Because the nobles did not want reform. The merchants were more concerned with their privileges than with abstract justice. The different groups fought with each other about status and precedence, and Catherine realized something devastating. Her beautiful vision of enlightened governance ran directly into the hard reality of Russian society and Russian power. Let me give you a specific example of the contradiction. The Nakaz suggested that harsh punishment should be avoided, that torture should be eliminated. Beautiful idea, right? But Russian law enforcement depended on harsh punishment and torture. The nobility used brutal methods to control their serfs. The state used torture to extract confessions. And if Catherine tried to actually eliminate these practices, she would face massive resistance from the very people who kept her in power. Or take the issue of serfdom. Catherine knew that serfdom was wrong. She had read the Enlightenment philosophers. She understood the arguments against slavery and unfree labor. And Russian serfdom in the 18th century was in many ways worse than American slavery. Serfs were tied to their owners, not to the land. A noble could sell serfs separately from the land, breaking up families, could punish them at will, could even under Catherine's reign sentence them to hard labor in Siberia, a punishment usually reserved for criminals. Catherine actually made this worse. Under her rule, nobles gained even more power over serfs. She could not abolish serfdom without losing the support of the nobility, and the nobility was her power base. So not only did she fail to limit serfdom, she expanded it. She gave away hundreds of thousands of state peasants to nobles as rewards for service, turning free peasants into serfs, the opposite of enlightenment. Do you see the paradox? Catherine genuinely believed in Enlightenment ideals. She was not faking it. Her correspondence with Voltaire was not just for show. She really admired him, really wanted his approval, but she also understood that implementing those ideals would undermine her own power. And when forced to choose between ideals and power, she chose power every time. Let us compare this to other enlightened despots of the era, because Catherine was not alone in this contradiction. Frederick the Great of Prussia also corresponded with Voltaire, also claimed to be enlightened. But Frederick never seriously tried to limit serfdom either. He modernized the Prussian army and bureaucracy, yes, but the social structure remained feudal. Joseph II of Austria was probably the most genuine in trying to implement enlightened reforms. He did abolish serfdom in the Austrian Empire in 1781. But you know what happened? The nobles revolted. He had to back down on many of his reforms. And after he died in 1790, most of his changes were reversed. So maybe the real question is not whether Catherine was a hypocrite, but whether enlightened despotism was even possible. Can you have a system where one person has absolute power and that person voluntarily limits their power based on rational principles? History suggests no, because the people with absolute power got that power through force and cunning, not through rationality. And maintaining power requires making compromises that betray ideals. But Catherine tried, at least in some areas. She did reform education, creating the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls in 1764, the first state-funded higher education for women in Europe. That was real progress. She founded the Moscow Orphanage in 1764, which took in over 40,000 children during her reign. The infant mortality rate was horrifyingly high. Most of those children died because 18th century medicine could not keep orphans alive. But the intention was progressive. She separated church and state education, removing religious control from schools. She established the first Russian law about religious tolerance, allowing Muslims to build mosques. When Christian leaders in Kazan complained that the mosques were being built too high, higher than churches, they asked Catherine to prohibit this. Her response was brilliant. She said she was the sovereign of the Russian land, but the sky was beyond her jurisdiction, basically telling them to deal with it. That showed genuine tolerance, genuine enlightened thinking. But these were small victories compared to the big failures. The nakaz went nowhere. The Legislative Commission was eventually suspended in 1768 when war with Turkey provided a convenient excuse. Most of Catherine's proposed legal reforms never happened, and the biggest issue, serfdom, actually got worse under her rule. Let me read you something Voltaire wrote to Catherine in 1771. He said, "I consider you the benefactress of Europe." The benefactress of Europe. That is what the leading thinker of the Enlightenment called her. But at that exact moment, Russian serfs were living in conditions that would shock any rational humanitarian. They had no legal rights, could be beaten, raped, sold, worked to death. And Catherine, the benefactress of Europe, was giving more power to the people who owned them. Was Voltaire naive, or was he just so invested in the idea of the enlightened monarch that he ignored the reality? Because Voltaire never visited Russia, never saw what Russian serfdom actually looked like. He knew Catherine through letters, through her writings, through the image she projected, and that image was carefully curated. Catherine was brilliant at public relations. She understood that controlling her reputation in Europe was almost as important as controlling Russia. So she wrote the nakaz knowing it would be published in France and circulated among the philosophes. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, knowing those letters would be shared and discussed. She was creating a brand, Catherine the Enlightened, and it worked. European intellectuals loved her. They held her up as proof that enlightened despotism could work. But inside Russia, different story. The nobles saw her as one of them, protecting their privileges. The serfs saw her as their oppressor. The church saw her as a secular ruler who could not be fully trusted. Catherine was different things to different audiences. That is politics at the highest level. Now, Diderot actually did visit Russia in 1773. Catherine had bought his library when he was in financial trouble, allowed him to keep using it, and paid him to be its librarian. It was a generous gesture, and Diderot came to St. Petersburg to thank her personally and to give her advice on governance. They had long conversations about reform, about Enlightenment principles, about how to improve Russia. And Diderot was shocked by what he found. Not by Catherine, he liked her personally, but by the reality of Russian autocracy. He tried to convince her to establish something like a constitutional monarchy to create checks on her power to give people more rights. And Catherine listened politely, but she did not implement any of it. Later she wrote that Diderot's ideas were fine for philosophy, but impossible in practice. She said, "You work only on paper which endures all things, but I, poor Empress, work on human skin, which is far more irritable and ticklish." That quote reveals everything. Human skin is irritable and ticklish, meaning real people resist change. They have interests, fears, traditions. You cannot just impose rational reforms from above because people are not rational. They are emotional, tribal, self-interested, and governing them requires working within those constraints. But is that true, or is it an excuse? Because other societies have made dramatic changes. The American Revolution happened in 1776, right in the middle of Catherine's reign. 13 colonies threw off monarchy entirely and created a republic based on Enlightenment principles. It was messy and imperfect and excluded most people initially, but it showed that radical change was possible. Catherine could have tried harder. She could have used her absolute power to force change, but she chose not to because forcing change would have risked her position. And here is the brutal honesty. Catherine valued her power more than her principles. When the two conflicted, power won. That does not make her evil. It makes her human, but it does make her less than the enlightened ideals she projected. Think about this in modern terms. How many leaders talk about progressive values while maintaining systems that contradict those values? How many politicians campaign on change and then govern to preserve their own position? How many people espouse ideals they are not willing to sacrifice for? Catherine was not unique in this. She was just doing it at an empire-defining scale. But there is something almost tragic about Catherine's Enlightenment period, about those early years when she really believed she could transform Russia through reason. You can see it in her early letters to Voltaire, the enthusiasm, the idealism. And then you can watch year by year as that idealism gets worn down by reality, by noble resistance, by peasant revolts, by wars, by the sheer difficulty of changing a massive traditional empire. By the 1770s, Catherine had largely given up on major reforms. She still talked about Enlightenment principles, still corresponded with philosophes, still patronized the arts and sciences. But the radical transformation she had envisioned, it was not happening, could not happen, not without a revolution. And Catherine was not going to start a revolution against herself, so instead, she focused on what she could control. Territorial expansion, military strength, cultural patronage, administrative efficiency, things that made Russia stronger without requiring fundamental social change. And in those areas, she succeeded brilliantly. Russia became a major European power under her. She added vast territories. She won wars. She made St. Petersburg a cultural capital. But the cost was borne by the people at the bottom, the serfs, the peasants, the people who worked the land and had no rights, no voice, no hope of improvement. And their suffering would eventually explode into violence because you cannot oppress millions of people indefinitely, even with all the power of the state behind you. Eventually, they resist. Eventually, they fight back. And when they did, Catherine's response showed exactly where her priorities lay. Because when faced with the largest peasant rebellion in Russian history, led by a man claiming to be her dead husband, Catherine did not respond with enlightened mercy or rational justice. She responded with overwhelming force and brutal repression. And that is where we are headed, next to a moment that tested everything Catherine claimed to believe and revealed the iron fist underneath the velvet glove. There is a word that appears over and over in documents from Catherine's Russia. The word is krepostnoy. It translates to serf. But that translation misses something crucial. Because when we hear serf in English, we think of medieval Europe, peasants tied to the land, working for lords, limited freedom, but still human beings with some rights. Russian serfdom in the 18th century was not that. It was something darker, something closer to what Americans would recognize as slavery. And most people have no idea how bad it really was. Let me give you some numbers first, because the scale is staggering. In 1762, when Catherine became empress, roughly half of Russia's population, about 20 million people, were serfs. 20 million. That is more than the entire population of many European countries at the time. And these were not just agricultural workers with limited mobility. These were people who were legally owned property. They could be bought and sold like furniture. But here is where it gets worse than medieval European serfdom. In most of Europe, serfs were tied to the land. You could not sell the land without the serfs, and you could not sell the serfs without the land. They went together. It created a kind of stability, not freedom, but at least predictability. In Russia, nobles could sell serfs separately from the land. They could sell individual people, breaking up families. A mother could be sold to one estate, her children to another, her husband to a third, legally, routinely. Imagine being a serf. You wake up one morning and your owner has gambling debts, so he sells you, just you. Your wife and children stay behind. You're taken hundreds of miles away to a different estate to work for a different master. You'll probably never see your family again. And this was not rare. This happened constantly. There were markets where serfs were sold. Advertisements in newspapers listing serfs for sale like livestock. Here is an actual advertisement from a Russian newspaper in the 1760s, for sale. A girl of 16 years trained in sewing and cooking. Also a blacksmith aged 40 with strong constitution. People being sold like tools, and this was completely normal, completely legal. Now, under Catherine's rule, the nobles got even more power over their serfs. In 1765, just 3 years into her reign, Catherine gave nobles the right to sentence their serfs to hard labor in Siberia. Read that again. A private citizen, a noble, could sentence another human being to Siberia. That was a punishment usually reserved for criminals convicted in a court of law. But now, if your owner decided you were troublesome, or if he just did not like you, he could send you to Siberia. No trial, no appeal, just exile to one of the harshest environments on earth. The only thing a noble could not legally do was kill a serf, because technically the serf's life belonged to the state, not to the individual owner. But in practice, nobles beat serfs to death and called it an accident. They worked them to death and said they were weak. They raped serf women with impunity. The legal protection was essentially meaningless. And here's the part that really reveals the horror. Serfs had no legal recourse. None. If your owner beat you, you could not go to the police. The police worked for the nobles. If your daughter was raped, you could not go to court. The courts would not hear your case. If your land was taken, your possessions stolen, your family separated, there was nothing you could do. You had no rights. You were property. Catherine knew this. She had read Enlightenment philosophy. She had corresponded with thinkers who argued passionately against slavery and oppression. Voltaire himself had written about the dignity of all human beings, and Catherine claimed to agree. But when she had the chance to actually do something about serfdom, she made it worse. Let me give you a specific example. Between 1762 and 1796, Catherine gave away approximately 800,000 state peasants to nobles as rewards for service. 800,000 people. These were people who'd been relatively free, who worked state lands, who had some limited rights, and Catherine turned them into private serfs. She enslaved 3/4 of a million people, not as a necessary evil, not as a temporary measure, but as gifts, rewards, incentives for loyalty. Why? Because the nobles were her power base. They had supported her coup against Peter. They ran the local governments. They commanded the armies, and they wanted more serfs because serfs were wealth. More serfs meant more agricultural production, more income, more labor for building estates and roads and infrastructure. The entire economy ran on serf labor, and if Catherine tried to limit or abolish serfdom, the nobles would turn against her. So she did not just maintain the system, she strengthened it. Now, let us compare this to American slavery because I think it helps us understand just how brutal Russian serfdom was. American slavery was horrific. Enslaved people had no freedom, were treated as property, suffered unspeakable violence and family separation. It was an abomination. But there were some differences that made Russian serfdom equally bad, maybe worse in certain ways. First scale. At its peak, American slavery involved about 4 million enslaved people. Russian serfdom involved 20 million, 5 times as many. Second, duration. American slavery lasted roughly 250 years from the colonial period to the Civil War. Russian serfdom lasted over 300 years and was not fully abolished until 1861, 4 years before American slavery ended. Third, invisibility. American slavery is widely taught, widely remembered, widely acknowledged as a moral catastrophe. Russian serfdom, most people outside of Russia have barely heard of it, but here's where they were similar. The dehumanization, the violence, the way systems of power justified oppression by claiming the oppressed were naturally inferior, naturally suited to servitude. American slaveholders said black people were less than human. Russian nobles said serfs were like children incapable of self-governance, needing firm control. It is the same logic, the same evil, dressed in different language. And just like in America, where enslaved people resisted in countless ways, running away sabotage occasional revolts, Russian serfs resisted too, constantly. Between 1762 and 1769, there were over 50 documented peasant revolts. 50 in 7 years. These were not small disturbances. These were hundreds or thousands of serfs rising up, attacking noble estates, sometimes killing their owners, trying to fight for freedom. Catherine's response: brutal suppression, send in the army, execute the leaders, flog the participants, increase surveillance and control. She did not see these revolts as a sign that the system was unjust. She saw them as threats to order that needed to be crushed, and crushed they were. But the revolts kept happening because you cannot oppress millions of people indefinitely without resistance. Human beings have a breaking point, and Russian serfs were being pushed past it constantly. The working conditions were brutal. Serfs typically had to work their owner's land 3 days a week, plus additional labor obligations. But many nobles demanded more: 4 days, 5 days, sometimes 6 days a week, leaving barely any time for serfs to work their own plots to feed their families. And the punishments for not meeting obligations: public flogging, sometimes hundreds of lashes. People died from these beatings. Women were flogged as well as men. Children as young as 10 or 12 could be beaten for not working fast enough. This was not ancient history. This was happening while Benjamin Franklin was writing about liberty in America, while Mozart was composing in Austria, while Enlightenment thinkers were celebrating human reason and dignity. In Russia, millions of people were living in conditions that would horrify anyone with a conscience. Catherine rationalized this. She told herself and her correspondents in France that Russian serfs were not ready for freedom, that they were too backward, too uneducated, too prone to chaos, that they needed the firm hand of noble control, or they would descend into anarchy. This is what oppressors always say, right? The oppressed are not ready for freedom. They need us to control them for their own good. It is the same excuse used by every empire, every slave society, every authoritarian regime. But here's what Catherine would not admit. The reason serfs seemed backward and uneducated was because the system kept them that way deliberately. Serfs were forbidden from receiving formal education in most cases. They were kept illiterate. They were not allowed to travel without permission. They were isolated on estates, cut off from broader society, and their nobles looked at them and said, "See, they are ignorant. They cannot govern themselves." It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. There were a few nobles who questioned the system. Alexander Radishchev wrote a book called A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow in 1790 that openly criticized serfdom and called it slavery. Catherine had him arrested and exiled to Siberia because she could not tolerate criticism of the system her power depended on, even if that criticism came from Enlightenment principles she claimed to share. Do you see the moral gymnastics here? Catherine reads Voltaire and Montesquieu and nods along with their ideas about liberty and justice. She incorporates those ideas into the nakaz. She presents herself to Europe as an enlightened ruler. But when someone in Russia says, "Hey, maybe we should actually apply these principles to the serfs," she has him arrested. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, and the serfs knew it. They were not stupid. They could see that Catherine talked about justice while denying them any. They could see nobles living in luxury built on their suffering. They could see the contradiction, and they were angry, furious, desperate, and that desperation was building toward an explosion. There is this concept in social movements called relative deprivation. It means that people do not revolt when things are at their absolute worst. They revolt when things are bad, but they can imagine them being better when they see that change is possible. And in the 1760s and early 1770s, Russian serfs could see that they had heard rumors about Catherine's nakaz, about proposals for limiting serfdom. They had heard about peasant revolts in other regions. They knew that somewhere, somehow, people were fighting back, and it gave them hope, dangerous hope. By 773, the warning signs were everywhere. Revolts were increasing, more serfs were running away. The Cossacks on the frontier were restless. The government was stretched thin from wars with Turkey. The conditions were perfect for a massive uprising, and all it needed was a spark, a leader, someone who could unite all that anger and desperation into a movement. And in September 1773, they found one, or rather, he found them. A Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev appeared in the Ural region and made an announcement that shocked Russia to its core. He claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. The murdered emperor miraculously survived and returned to reclaim his throne, and thousands upon thousands of serfs, Cossacks, and peasants believed him, or at least they wanted to believe him. Because here is the genius of what Pugachev did. He did not just promise to overthrow Catherine, he promised to abolish serfdom entirely, to give the land to the peasants, to execute the nobles, to create a world where the people at the bottom were finally free. It was a revolutionary message, and it spread like wildfire across the Russian countryside. Within months, Pugachev had an army, a real army, tens of thousands of followers, and they were marching toward the heart of Russia. Catherine had faced threats before, political rivals, foreign enemies, court conspiracies. But this was different. This was the oppressed rising up. This was the system she had strengthened turning against her. This was her worst nightmare. Because if Pugachev succeeded, if the serfs actually won, everything she had built would collapse. Her reign, her legacy, her life, all of it was suddenly at stake. And her response to this threat would reveal exactly who Catherine really was beneath all the Enlightenment rhetoric. Would she show mercy, understanding, and attempt at reform? Or would she show the iron fist that had always been there, hidden under velvet? September 17th, 1793. A man rode into a Cossack settlement near the Yaik River. He was in his early 40s, stocky, bearded, scarred. He had the look of someone who had lived hard. And when the Cossacks gathered around him, he made an announcement that would change Russian history. He said, "I am Emperor Peter III. I did not die in 1762. I escaped. I have been in hiding for 11 years, and now I have returned to reclaim my throne and free my people." Now, you might be thinking, how could anyone believe this? Peter III had been dead for 11 years. His death was announced. There was a funeral. Everyone knew he was dead. But here's what you need to understand about 18th century Russia. Information traveled slowly. Most peasants and serfs could not read. They had never seen Peter III in person. They only knew him from rumors and descriptions. And more importantly, there was a tradition in Russian culture of the true czar. The idea that a good czar had been wrongfully deposed or killed but would return to save the people. This tradition existed because it gave hope. When life under the current ruler was unbearable, people comforted themselves with the fantasy that somewhere the rightful czar was alive, waiting to come back and make things right. It happened over and over in Russian history. False Dmitri, claiming to be the murdered son of Ivan the Terrible, false Peters, and false Alexeis. The true czar was always the one who promised what people wanted to hear, and Pugachev understood this perfectly. He was not actually educated, but he was cunning. He was born a Don Cossack, had served in the Russian army, fought in the 7 Years' War and against Turkey. He had deserted in 1771, wandered around, gotten in trouble with authorities. He was nobody, a peasant with military experience and a talent for survival. But he was also charismatic. He could speak to people, make them believe. So when he showed up claiming to be Peter III, he did not just make the claim. He backed it up with a story. He said that on the night he was supposed to be murdered, loyal guards had helped him escape. They killed someone else and passed off the body as his. He had fled, lived in hiding, traveled the country disguised as a pilgrim. He had seen the suffering of his people under the German usurper Catherine, and now he was back to free them, and critically, he made promises. He issued manifestos, official-sounding decrees, abolishing serfdom, giving land to the peasants, eliminating taxes, executing the nobles who had oppressed the people. He painted a picture of a Russia where the serfs were free, the land was theirs, and justice finally existed. Can you imagine hearing this if you were a serf? If your entire life had been suffering and exploitation, of course you would want to believe it. Of course you would follow him. The rebellion started small, a few hundred Cossacks, but it grew incredibly fast. Within a month, Pugachev had several thousand followers. Within 3 months, Tens of thousands. They attacked and captured forts, arsenals, small towns. They killed nobles, burned estates, freed serfs who immediately joined the rebellion. It was like a wildfire spreading across the Russian countryside. And here is what made it so dangerous. This was not just a peasant revolt. Pugachev attracted different groups with different grievances. Cossacks who resented government control over their traditional freedoms. Factory workers in the Ural mines who were basically enslaved. Non-Russian ethnic groups. Bashkirs, Kalmyks, Kazakhs who had been conquered and oppressed by the Russian Empire. Old Believers, a religious sect that had been persecuted. All these groups saw Pugachev as their liberator. By the summer of 1774, Pugachev's army was massive. Estimates vary, but at its peak he probably had between 30,000 and 40,000 fighters, and they were not just an angry mob. They had organization, military discipline, artillery. Pugachev set up a court that mimicked the imperial court in St. Petersburg. He appointed ministers and generals from among his followers. He issued decrees with official seals. He was creating an alternative government. In July 1774, Pugachev captured the city of Kazan. Kazan. That is a major city, one of the oldest and most important in Russia. The rebels stormed it, overwhelmed the defenders, took control. They burned much of the city, killed nobles and officials. It was a catastrophic defeat for Catherine's forces, and suddenly Pugachev was only about 400 miles from Moscow. The capital itself seemed within reach. Think about what this meant. Catherine had been empress for 12 years. She had won wars against Turkey. She had expanded the empire. She had established herself as a powerful ruler. And now a Cossack rebel, pretending to be her dead husband, had captured a major city and was threatening the heart of Russia. The humiliation was profound. The danger was existential. But here's what fascinates me. Catherine's initial response was to dismiss the threat. When reports of Pugachev first reached St. Petersburg in late 1773, she did not take it seriously. She called him an imposter, a bandit, nothing to worry about. She was fighting a war with Turkey at the time and did not want to divert resources. She thought local authorities could handle it. That was a massive miscalculation. By the time she realized how serious this was, by mid-1784, Pugachev controlled huge swaths of territory. The rebellion had spread across the Volga region, the Urals, into Siberia. Millions of people were living under Pugachev's rule, or at least outside of Catherine's control. This was not a revolt. This was a civil war. And Catherine was not clearly winning, so she pivoted completely. She pulled back from the war with Turkey and signed a peace treaty, even though she could have gotten better terms by continuing to fight. Why? Because she needed her army home. She needed those experienced soldiers and commanders to fight Pugachev. She made General Alexander Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest military leaders, commander of the anti-Pugachev forces. She threw everything at this problem. And slowly, the tide turned. Suvorov was brilliant, ruthless, but brilliant. He did not try to chase Pugachev's entire army. He focused on cutting off supplies, isolating rebel-held territories, targeting Pugachev's key commanders, professional military tactics against what was ultimately a peasant army, however large and motivated. But what really doomed Pugachev was not military defeat. It was betrayal. By September 1774, after the capture of Kazan, Pugachev's forces were being pushed back. They had suffered losses, supply lines were breaking down, and some of his own Cossack officers started to doubt, started to think, maybe we should cut a deal, save ourselves. On September 14, 1774, a group of Pugachev's own Cossacks arrested him. They tied him up and handed him over to government forces. Just like that, the Great Rebellion collapsed because without their charismatic leader, without the true Tsar, the followers lost hope. Armies started deserting, towns surrendered. Within weeks, it was over. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in a metal cage. Literally, they built a cage on a cart and transported him like an animal, displaying him to crowds along the way. Can you imagine the psychological warfare of that? Showing people, look, your emperor is in a cage. He is powerless. This is what happens to rebels. And then came the trial. It was not really a trial, it was theater. Pugachev was questioned, tortured for information about his supporters. He confessed everything, admitted he was not Peter III, pleaded for mercy. There would be none. On January 10, 1775, in a public square in Moscow, Yemelyan Pugachev was executed. The method was quartering, being tied to 4 horses that pulled in different directions, tearing the body apart. It was one of the most brutal execution methods available, reserved for the worst traitors. They wanted to make an example. They wanted everyone to see what happened when you challenged the empire. Except there is a twist. According to some reports, the executioner secretly beheaded Pugachev first before the quartering, a mercy killing. Whether this was compassion or a pragmatic decision to make the execution easier to carry out, we do not know. But if it is true, it suggests that even in this moment of brutal state violence, someone felt a shred of humanity for the condemned man. After Pugachev's execution, Catherine ordered systematic reprisals. Villages that had supported the rebellion were burned, leaders were hanged, hundreds, probably thousands of people were executed or sent to Siberia. The message was clear. Revolt against the empire and you will be destroyed. Your families will suffer. Your communities will be erased. But Catherine also tried to erase the memory of the rebellion itself. She renamed the Yaik River, where the rebellion started, to the Ural River. She forbade mentioning Pugachev's name in official documents. She wanted to pretend it had never happened, because the rebellion exposed something she could not acknowledge. The system she ruled over was so unjust that millions of people would follow an obvious impostor just for the chance at freedom. Let us think about why this rebellion happened in the first place. Yes, Pugachev was charismatic. Yes, the timing was right with Catherine distracted by war, but the fundamental cause was the brutality of serfdom. If serfs had been treated with basic human dignity, if they had rights, if they had hope for a better future, would they have risked everything to follow Pugachev? Probably not. The rebellion was a message, a scream. Millions of people saying we cannot live like this anymore. We would rather fight and die than continue in slavery. And Catherine's response was not to reform the system. It was to crush the rebellion and strengthen the system even more. After Pugachev, she gave nobles even more power over serfs, made punishments harsher, increased surveillance. The lesson she learned was not we need to treat people better, it was we need better control. Compare this to other moments in history when the oppressed have risen up. The Haitian Revolution starting in 1791, where enslaved people successfully overthrew their masters and created an independent nation. The Spartacus Rebellion in ancient Rome, where gladiators and slaves fought for years against the Roman legions. The various peasant revolts in medieval Europe. What do they all have in common? They were responses to systems of oppression that had become unbearable, and they all forced the ruling classes to confront uncomfortable truths about their power. But here's the thing about Pugachev's rebellion that makes it particularly interesting: the use of legitimacy as a weapon. Pugachev claimed to be the rightful czar. He did not argue that the czarist system should be abolished. He argued that he was the real czar and Catherine was the usurper. That is brilliant strategy because it was not asking people to imagine a completely different system of government, which is psychologically difficult. It was asking them to swap one ruler for another, which was easier to conceptualize. But it also limited the rebellion's revolutionary potential. If Pugachev had succeeded, would he have actually abolished serfdom, created a democratic system, given power to the people? Or would he have just become another czar ruling through the same authoritarian structures? We will never know. But history suggests that rebellions led by charismatic individuals often just replace one tyrant with another. The other thing Pugachev's rebellion reveals is how fragile authoritarian legitimacy really is. Catherine had absolute power on paper. But when a Cossack nobody claimed to be the true ruler, tens of thousands of people believed him, or at least they were willing to act as if they believed him, because legitimacy is not about legal right. It is about perception. If enough people stop believing in your authority, you do not have authority anymore. You just have force, and force alone cannot hold an empire together forever. Catherine understood this. That is why she worked so hard to control her image, to correspond with philosophes, to project enlightenment and culture, because she knew her legitimacy was shaky. She was a foreign-born woman who had overthrown her husband. She had no hereditary claim to the throne in the traditional sense. Her power came from a coup and from maintaining the support of the nobility and military. If that support ever wavered, she would be vulnerable. Pugachev exploited that vulnerability. He showed that an alternative was possible, that people could imagine Russia without Catherine. And even though he failed, even though he was executed in that horrible way, the fear he created stayed with Catherine for the rest of her reign. She never forgot how close she came to losing everything. How quickly an empire could unravel when the people at the bottom decided they had nothing left to lose. But if you think the brutality of serfdom and the crushing of Pugachev's rebellion represent the darkest parts of Catherine's legacy, well, we are not done yet because we need to talk about what Catherine actually built during her reign. The cultural achievements, the institutions, the cities, the art, the things she is actually celebrated for. Because there is a profound contradiction at the heart of Catherine's Russia. How did one of history's most oppressive societies also produce one of its most magnificent cultural flowerings? How can a nation built on slavery create such beauty? And what does that tell us about the relationship between oppression and art, between suffering and culture? Walk with me through the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, circa 1790. Your footsteps echo on marble floors. The ceilings soar above you, covered in frescoes and gold leaf. You turn a corner and enter a gallery. And then you stop, because hanging on the walls in front of you are paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, Raphael, Titian, Van Dyck. Some of the greatest masterpieces ever created by human hands, all collected by one woman, Catherine the Great. And this is just one room. There are hundreds more. The Hermitage Museum began as Catherine's private collection, and when I say collection, I mean obsession. Catherine did not just buy art, she devoured it. She competed with other European monarchs to acquire the best pieces, the rarest works, the most significant collections, and she won. By the time she died in 1796, she owned approximately 4,000 paintings, 10,000 engraved gems, 10,000 drawings, and countless sculptures and decorative arts. It was the largest private art collection in the world. But here's what gets me. She actually bought her first major collection site unseen. In 1764, just 2 years into her reign, she heard that a Berlin merchant named Johann Ernst Gotskowski had assembled a collection of 225 paintings for Frederick the Great of Prussia, but Frederick could not afford to pay for them because he was broke from the 7 Years' War. So Catherine swooped in and bought the entire collection, 225 paintings. She had never seen them. She just wanted them before anyone else could have them. That is power move energy right there. And it was not just about owning beautiful things. Catherine understood that culture was political. Art was legitimacy. If Russia had the finest art collection in Europe, if St. Petersburg rivaled Paris and Vienna as a cultural center, then Russia was not some backward frontier empire. It was civilized, sophisticated, worthy of respect. Catherine was using paintings and sculptures to make a statement about Russia's place in the world. But here is where it gets morally complicated. Where did the money come from? Serf labor, taxes collected from oppressed peasants. The beauty in those galleries was built on suffering. Every Rembrandt hanging on the wall represented resources extracted from people who had no freedom, no rights, no say in how their labor was used. The cultural flowering was inseparable from the exploitation that funded it. This is a pattern throughout history, is it not? The pyramids of Egypt were built by slave labor. The Parthenon in Athens was constructed by a society that enslaved a third of its population. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were funded by peasants who could barely feed themselves. Renaissance art was commissioned by oligarchs who ruled through violence and corruption. Beauty and brutality have always walked hand in hand. But does knowing that change how we see the art? Should it? If you stand in front of a Rembrandt in the Hermitage today, does it matter that it was purchased with money from a slave economy? Or is the art somehow separate from its context, beautiful regardless of its origins? These are not easy questions, and I do not have simple answers, but I think we have to sit with the discomfort of them. Now, let us talk about education, because this is where Catherine's contradictions become even more apparent. In 1764, the same year she bought that first art collection, Catherine founded the Smolny Institute for Noble Girls in St. Petersburg. And this was genuinely revolutionary. It was the first state-funded institution for higher education for women in Europe, not just in Russia, in all of Europe. Think about that for a second. Women in the 18th century were not supposed to need education beyond basic literacy, maybe some music and dancing. The idea of women studying science, philosophy, mathematics, languages, that was radical, dangerous even, because educated women might start questioning their subordinate status. They might want power, autonomy, rights, and Catherine created an institution to educate them. Anyway, the Smolny Institute started with noble girls only. They entered at age 6 and stayed until they were 18, 12 years of intensive education. They studied French, German, arithmetic, geography, history, drawing, music, dancing. They learned impeccable manners. They were taught to think, to read, to engage with ideas, and yes, they were also taught to revere the Empress. Catherine understood that educating women who would then be loyal to her created a network of influence throughout Russian society. But here is the limitation. It was only for nobles. Serfs could not attend. Merchant-class girls were excluded for years. So Catherine was advancing women's education, but only for the elite. She was not challenging the fundamental class structure. She was not saying all women deserve education. She was saying noble women deserve education because they need to be proper wives and mothers for the ruling class. It was progressive within very narrow bounds. Still, the impact was real. Women who graduated from Smolny became teachers themselves, spreading education further. Some became writers, translators, salon hostesses who shaped intellectual culture. Catherine had opened a door, even if it was only a crack, and sometimes a crack is enough for light to get in. Then there's the Moscow Orphanage, founded in 1764. This project reveals both Catherine's genuine compassion and the brutal limits of 18th century medicine and social welfare. The idea was beautiful. Take in abandoned children, illegitimate children, orphans from the streets, give them food, shelter, education, train them in trade so they could become productive citizens. Create a new generation lifted out of poverty through state intervention. Catherine was personally invested in this. She provided funding, visited the orphanage, took interest in its operations. And over the course of her reign, the Moscow orphanage admitted more than 40,000 children. 40,000. That is an astonishing number for an 18th century institution. It shows scale, ambition, commitment. But the mortality rate was catastrophic. Most estimates suggest that between 75 and 85% of the children admitted to the orphanage died. 75 to 85%. Of those 40,000 children, probably 30,000 to 35,000 died there from disease, malnutrition, the general inability of 18th century medicine to keep infant mortality low even in the best conditions, and orphanages were not the best conditions. So was the Moscow orphanage a success or a failure? It saved thousands of children who would have otherwise died on the streets, but it also became in effect a death sentence for many others. The intentions were good. The execution was in many ways a tragedy. And Catherine knew this. She received reports about the mortality rates. She tried reforms, better ventilation, more nurses, more feeding practices. Nothing really worked. But she kept the orphanage running because what was the alternative? Let those children die on the streets instead. This is the complexity of evaluating historical figures. Catherine did something that was ahead of its time, state-funded care for orphans. But the results were mixed at best, horrific at worst. Do we give her credit for trying or condemn her for the deaths? Both. Probably both. Let me tell you about another economic innovation that shows Catherine's practical side, the introduction of paper money. Before 1769, Russia's economy ran on silver and gold coins. But Catherine's military campaigns were expensive. Wars with Turkey, the costs of administering new territories, the expenses of her cultural projects. It all drained the treasury. There was not enough silver and gold in circulation for people to conduct large transactions. So, Catherine created the Assignation Bank in 1769 and started issuing paper rubles. This was not unique to Russia. Other countries had paper money, but it was new for Russia and represented a significant modernization. Paper money made trade easier, allowed for larger transactions, helped the economy function more smoothly. The assignation ruble would remain in use until 1843, long after Catherine's death. That is lasting impact. But of course, like everything else, this benefited the merchant and noble classes far more than it helped serfs. Serfs were not conducting large financial transactions. They were not participating in the money economy in meaningful ways. So even this economic modernization reinforced existing inequalities. Now, let us talk about architecture because Catherine transformed St. Petersburg physically. She commissioned dozens of major buildings in the neoclassical style. The Hermitage building itself, the Academy of Arts, the Marble Palace, expansions of the Winter Palace. She brought in architects from across Europe. She wanted St. Petersburg to look like the great European capitals, like Paris, like Vienna, like Rome. And she succeeded. If you walk through St. Petersburg today, you're walking through Catherine's vision. Those grand boulevards, those imposing facades, those palaces as monuments, they are her legacy made stone. It is genuinely beautiful, one of the most architecturally stunning cities in the world. But who built those buildings? Serfs, forced labor, men who worked on construction projects as part of their obligations to the state or to nobles. They carved the stone, laid the foundations, created the beauty, and they were not paid fairly, not honored, not remembered. Their names are not on plaques. They are invisible in the historical record, but without them, none of it would exist. There is a famous story about Catherine visiting a construction site for one of her projects. She asked a worker what he was doing. He said, "I am earning my bread." She asked another worker the same question. He said, "I am laying bricks." She asked a third worker, and he said, "I am building a cathedral." Catherine supposedly praised the third worker for understanding the larger vision. But I think about that first worker, the one just trying to earn bread. That was probably the most honest answer. Most people building Catherine's vision were just trying to survive. Catherine also established the Russian Academy of Arts, founded in 1757, but reorganized and expanded under her patronage. She created scholarships for talented students to study in Europe. She commissioned Russian artists for major works. She was trying to create a homegrown Russian artistic tradition, not just import European culture. And this had lasting impact. Russian art, music, and literature in the 19th century built on foundations Catherine helped establish. But again, access was limited. Serf children could not attend the academy. Poor children from merchant families had little chance. The cultural renaissance Catherine fostered was for the elite. It did not reach down to the masses. So, here's the question I keep coming back to. Was Catherine's cultural legacy real progress, or was it performative? Was she genuinely trying to elevate Russian civilization, or was she just buying prestige? And does it matter if the results were the same? I think it was both. Catherine genuinely loved art, ideas, culture. Her letters show real engagement with philosophical questions, real appreciation for beauty. But she also understood the political value of culture. She knew that being seen as enlightened increased her legitimacy in Europe, made her harder to dismiss or attack. The personal and the political were intertwined in ways that probably cannot be separated. Compare Catherine's cultural patronage to that of other monarchs. Louis XI of France built Versailles and patronized artists, not just for beauty, but to centralize power and impress rivals. The Medici in Florence supported Renaissance art partly from genuine love of beauty, and partly to legitimize their rule. Elizabeth I of England used pageantry and art to craft her image as the Virgin Queen and unite England. Power and culture have always been connected, but there is something particularly striking about Catherine's situation. She was an outsider, German-born, not Russian by blood. She came to power through a coup and possible murder. Her legitimacy was always questionable, so she had to work harder than most monarchs to establish her place. And culture was one of the tools she used. Every painting she acquired, every building she commissioned, every intellectual she corresponded with was partly about saying, "I belong here. I am worthy. Russia under my rule is great," and it worked. The term Catherinian era is still used to describe a golden age of Russian culture. Her reign is remembered as a high point. The art she collected is still displayed in the Hermitage. The buildings she commissioned still stand. The institutions she founded still exist in various forms. That is legacy. That is impact. But it is legacy built on contradiction, built on the labor of people who had no freedom, built with money extracted from an oppressed population, built by a woman who claimed enlightened values while strengthening the most oppressive social system in Europe. How do we hold all of that complexity? How do we appreciate the beauty while acknowledging the brutality? Maybe the answer is that we do not resolve the contradiction. We live with it. We recognize that history is messy, that people contain multitudes, that good and evil are not always separate. Catherine was capable of genuine cultural vision and genuine cruelty, of enlightened thinking and oppressive action, of creating beauty and enabling suffering. She was, in other words, deeply human, complicated, contradictory, real. But there is one part of Catherine's story that has overshadowed almost everything else we've talked about. One set of rumors and legends that have become more famous than her actual accomplishments. And most of them are lies. Vicious, sexist lies designed to humiliate and diminish her. And we need to talk about them, because the way Catherine has been portrayed in popular culture, the myths that have been spread about her for over 2 centuries, tell us as much about our society as they do about hers. Let me ask you a question. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the name Catherine the Great? Be honest. For a lot of people, unfortunately, it is not the territorial expansion or the art collection or the Enlightenment ideals. It is a rumor, a disgusting false rumor about how she died. The horse rumor. And I'm going to tell you right now, it is completely, totally, 100% false. Catherine the Great did not die having sex with a horse. She died of a stroke in her bed, fully clothed, surrounded by servants at age 67. But that rumor has persisted for over 200 years. It shows up in movies, TV shows, jokes, casual conversation. People repeat it like it is fact. And every time it gets repeated, it does exactly what it was designed to do. It turns one of history's most accomplished female rulers into a punchline, into a deviant, into a joke. And that is not an accident. That is the point. So where did this rumor come from? We do not know exactly, but it emerged shortly after Catherine's death in 1796. Probably started in France, spread by her political enemies and by people who resented Russian power. And it stuck because it was salacious, shocking, the kind of story people want to repeat because it is outrageous. Never mind that it makes no logical sense. Never mind that there is zero evidence. Never mind that the actual circumstances of her death are well documented. The lie was more entertaining than the truth. Here is what actually happened on November 17th, 1796. Catherine woke up that morning feeling fine. She went to her dressing room as usual, and then she suffered a massive stroke and collapsed. Her servants found her unconscious on the floor. They carried her to her bed. Doctors were called. They tried bloodletting, which was the standard useless treatment of the time. Catherine never regained consciousness. She died that evening around 9:45 p.m. That is it. That is the actual story. Boring, right? No scandal, no drama, just an elderly woman dying of a stroke, which is how millions of people have died throughout history. But the truth could not compete with the lie because the lie served a purpose. It said this woman had too much power, too much freedom, too much sexual agency. And look what happened to her. Divine punishment, karmic justice. She died in the most humiliating way possible because she deserved it for transgressing proper female behavior. The rumor was not about what actually happened. It was about what people wished had happened because it confirmed their prejudices. And it is not just the horse rumor. There is another legend that has circulated for years about an erotic furniture room that Catherine supposedly had at the Gatchina Palace. According to this story, she had a secret room filled with furniture decorated with giant penises and vulvas, tables with penises for legs, walls covered in pornographic art, statues of naked figures engaging in every possible sex act, the whole room supposedly designed for orgies or voyeurism or whatever scandalous purpose people wanted to imagine. The story goes that two Wehrmacht officers saw this room when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. They filed a report. But conveniently, no one has ever found that report. No photographs exist. No inventory from the palace mentions such a room. No documentation from before, during, or after World War II confirms it. The only evidence is the legend itself passed around and embellished with each retelling. Could such a room have existed? I suppose technically anything is possible. But think about the logistics. Catherine was a public figure whose palaces had hundreds of staff members, servants, guards, officials, visitors. How would she keep a whole room of pornographic furniture secret? Why would she need to? She was the Empress. She could do what she wanted privately. Creating an elaborate showpiece room makes no sense unless it was meant to be seen. And if it was meant to be seen, where are the contemporary accounts? The most likely explanation is that the story is invented, or perhaps based on a tiny grain of truth. Maybe Catherine owned some art depicting classical mythology with nudity, which was common in 18th century aristocratic collections, and that got exaggerated into this elaborate fantasy of a sex dungeon for an empress because people wanted to believe Catherine was that debauched. It confirmed the narrative. Here's another one. The legend that Catherine kept her hairdresser locked in a cage to prevent her from revealing the secrets of her elaborate wigs. This is absurd on multiple levels. First, if Catherine wanted to keep someone quiet, she had actual prisons in Siberia. She did not need to keep them in a decorative cage like a pet bird. Second, hairstyling was not some state secret. Every noble woman at court had elaborate hairstyles. It was the fashion. There was no secret to protect. But again, the rumor persists because it paints Catherine as tyrannical and vain. As a woman so obsessed with her appearance that she would imprison someone to protect her beauty routine, it plays into stereotypes about women and vanity, about women and pettiness, and it diminishes her actual accomplishments by focusing on trivial matters. Then there is the claim that Catherine advocated for having sex 6 times a day. Where does that number come from? No credible source. It is just something people say, usually with a wink and a nudge, as if it proves she was a nymphomaniac. But think about it logically. Catherine ruled an empire. She read voraciously. She wrote letters and manifestos and legislation. She attended to state business, met with advisors, dealt with military campaigns and diplomatic crises. When exactly would she have time for sex 6 times a day? The claim is ridiculous, but it gets repeated anyway. Why? Why do these rumors persist when they are so obviously false? Because they serve an important function for people who want to undermine powerful women. They shift the conversation away from what Catherine accomplished to what she supposedly did in private. They make her sexuality the most interesting thing about her instead of her reign. They reduce a complex, brilliant, consequential historical figure to a collection of sexual rumors. And this is not unique to Catherine. This happens to powerful women throughout history and today. Cleopatra is remembered more for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony than for her political acumen and successful rule of Egypt for decades. Marie Antoinette is defined by false quotes like, "Let them eat cake," and scandalous rumors about her private life, rather than the complex political situation she navigated. Anne Boleyn's entire legacy is overshadowed by sexual accusations that were probably invented to justify her execution. In modern times, we see the same pattern. Female politicians face questions about their appearance, their relationships, their families in ways male politicians do not. Their voices are criticized as too shrill or too soft. Their clothing choices are analyzed. Rumors about their private lives circulate on social media. The tactics have updated, but the goal is the same. Undermine women in power by making their gender and sexuality the issue instead of their competence. Now, let us talk about the men who spread these rumors about Catherine. Frederick the Great, whom we've mentioned before, said about her, "A woman is always a woman, and in feminine government, the censored has more influence than a firm policy guided by straight reason." That is a quote from one of the most powerful men in Europe about a woman who repeatedly outmaneuvered him politically and militarily. He could not defeat her, so he tried to diminish her with crude sexism, and it worked to an extent. Those attitudes spread. They became conventional wisdom. They shaped how Catherine was remembered. Even today, if you Google Catherine the Great, the autocomplete suggestions include terms related to the horse rumor and sexual scandals before they include her actual accomplishments. That is Frederick's legacy. That is what misogyny does. It outlasts the people who spread it and becomes embedded in the historical record. Catherine's own son, Emperor Paul I, hated his mother for various reasons. She had kept him from power. She may have questioned his legitimacy. Their relationship was cold. And after she died, one of his first acts was to pass a law forbidding women from ever ascending to the Russian throne again. Think about the symbolism. His mother had ruled successfully for 34 years. She had expanded the empire, strengthened Russia, created cultural institutions, navigated complex international politics. And his response was to make sure no woman could ever do it again. That law stayed in effect until the Russian monarchy was abolished in 1917. For over a century, no woman could be Empress of Russia in her own right, all because Paul could not handle the fact that his mother was more capable than he was. And Paul's brief reign from 1796 to 1801 was chaotic and ended with his assassination in a coup. So the woman he tried to erase from legacy accomplished more in 1 year than he did in his entire reign. But the sexist law remained. The Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, writing in the 19th century, called Catherine a Tartuffe in skirts, a hypocrite who pretended to be enlightened but was just power-hungry. He focused on the contradictions in her reign, which are real and worth examining. But notice the language in skirts. He had to gender it, had to make it about her being a woman pretending to be something she was not. Male rulers who were hypocritical, and there were plenty, were not described as tartuffes in trousers. The hypocrisy was not gendered for them. So let us be clear about what these rumors and insults represent. They are a coordinated centuries-long campaign to undermine Catherine's legacy by focusing on her gender and invented sexual scandals instead of her actual reign. And it has been devastatingly effective. Ask a random person on the street what they know about Catherine the Great, and they are more likely to mention false sex scandals than the fact that she added 200,000 square miles to the Russian Empire. More likely to laugh about imagined deviancy than to discuss her correspondence with Voltaire. More likely to repeat disgusting lies than to acknowledge her genuine accomplishments. And here is what makes me angry about this. Catherine was not perfect. We have spent this entire story examining her flaws, her hypocrisies, her failures, the nakaz that went nowhere, the serfdom that got worse, the brutal suppression of Pugachev's rebellion, the gap between her Enlightenment ideals and her oppressive actions. These are real criticisms based on real historical facts. We should examine them. We should hold Catherine accountable for her choices and their consequences. But that is not what the sex scandals do. They do not offer legitimate criticism. They offer mockery and diminishment. They say, never mind what she actually did. Let us talk about what we imagine she did in private. Let us make her a joke. Let us make her less than human. And that is not historical analysis. That is character assassination. The tragedy is that Catherine anticipated this. She knew the gossip, the rumors, the whispers. She knew that being a woman in power made her vulnerable to this kind of attack in ways male rulers were not. And she tried to counter it through accomplishments, through cultural patronage, through creating a legacy so significant it could not be ignored. She tried to be so obviously great that the slander would not stick, and to some extent she succeeded. She is called Catherine the Great after all. That title means something. It acknowledges her impact. But the fact that we still have to debunk the horse rumor over 200 years later shows that she did not fully succeed. The misogyny was too strong, too persistent, too useful for too many people. So the next time someone brings up the horse rumor at a party, shut it down. Correct them. Say, no, that is false. She died of a stroke, and she ruled Russia for 34 years, expanded the empire massively, patronized the arts, corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers, and transformed her adopted country into a major European power. Those are the facts. The sex scandals are propaganda. Because here's the thing, we get to choose which stories we repeat. We get to decide whether we perpetuate lies or whether we demand truth. And every time we repeat a false rumor about Catherine, we are participating in the very sexism that created those rumors in the first place. We are saying that powerful women deserve to be mocked and diminished, that their accomplishments matter less than salacious gossip. I refuse to do that. And I hope after listening to this story you refuse too. Catherine the Great deserves to be judged on what she actually did. The good and the bad, the progressive and the oppressive, the brilliant and the brutal. She deserves historical accuracy, not historical slander. She deserves to be taken seriously as one of the most significant rulers of the 18th century, regardless of gender. And she deserves better than to be remembered primarily for lies told by men who could not handle a woman being more powerful than they were. So now we come to the end of this journey. We have traveled from a freezing castle in Prussia, where a poor German princess was born, through 18 years of humiliation and preparation, through a brilliant coup and a suspicious death, through lovers and wars and rebellions and cultural achievements. We have seen Catherine at her best and at her worst. We've examined her ideals and her betrayals, her accomplishments and her failures. And now we have to answer the hardest question of all. What is her legacy? How should we remember Catherine the Great? Was she truly great? Or was she a brilliant opportunist who succeeded through ruthlessness and luck? Can we celebrate her accomplishments while acknowledging the suffering they were built on? And what lessons does her story hold for us today? November 17th, 1796. The day Catherine died. And in the hours after her death, as word spread through St. Petersburg, something remarkable happened. People wept, not just courtiers who depended on her favor, ordinary people in the streets, merchants, soldiers, servants. They cried for their empress, the German princess who had become more Russian than Russians. And in that moment, Despite everything we've talked about, the contradictions, the failures, the oppression, they recognized that something significant had ended. An era, a vision, a force. So, let us talk about what Catherine actually left behind. Not the myths, not the scandals, but the tangible, measurable legacy, because the numbers are staggering. When Catherine took power in 1762, the Russian Empire covered approximately 6.5 million square miles. When she died in 1796, it covered 6.7 million square miles. She added roughly 200,000 square miles of territory. That is an area larger than modern-day France, larger than California, and she did not acquire it through luck or inheritance. She took it through war, diplomacy, and strategic calculation. The First Russo-Turkish War from 1768 to 1774 gave Russia access to the Black Sea. This was huge. For centuries, Russia had been landlocked in the south, unable to project naval power into the Mediterranean or trade freely with southern Europe. Catherine changed that. The Treaty of Coup-in 1774 was one of the most advantageous peace treaties Russia had ever signed. Russia gained ports, gained territory in what is now Ukraine, gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. That last provision would be used for the next century to justify Russian interference in Ottoman affairs. Then came the annexation of Crimea in 1783. Catherine did not just conquer it militarily, she integrated it. She sent Potemkin to develop the region, build cities, establish infrastructure. Sevastopol became one of Russia's most important naval bases, a position it holds to this day. The geopolitical significance of controlling Crimea cannot be overstated. It gave Russia power projection into the Black Sea and beyond. And then there were the partitions of Poland. This is the darkest part of Catherine's territorial expansion. Poland-Lithuania was one of Europe's major powers, but it was politically weak, divided internally, and Catherine, along with Prussia and Austria, decided to just carve it up. The first partition in 1772, the second in 1793, the third in 1795. By the time they were done, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. It would not reappear on the map until 1918. Was this justified? No. It was pure power politics. Taking territory because you could, because the victim was weak and divided, because your rivals would take it if you did not. It was cynical, brutal imperialism, and Catherine participated fully, taking the largest share of Polish territory. So when we talk about her legacy of expansion, we need to acknowledge this was empire building. This was conquest. This came at the cost of Polish independence and Polish suffering. But from a Russian perspective, Catherine transformed the empire into a dominant European power. When she took the throne, Russia was seen as a backward frontier state. By the time she died, Russia was one of the great powers, a nation that had to be considered in every major European diplomatic and military calculation. That is impact. That is legacy. Now, why did Catherine succeed where other female rulers struggled or failed? Because history is full of queens and empresses who had power but could not hold it, or who held it but could not wield it effectively. Let us compare Mary I of England. Bloody Mary tried to reverse the Protestant Reformation and restore Catholicism. She burned hundreds of people at the stake and died hated by her subjects. Her reign was defined by religious violence and failure. Elizabeth of Reims, her half-sister, was far more successful. But Elizabeth never married, never took acknowledged lovers, and presented herself as the Virgin Queen. She sacrificed personal life for political survival. Mary, Queen of Scots, was brilliant and charming, but made terrible political decisions, married disastrously, and ended up imprisoned and executed. Maria Theresa of Austria was successful, but she ruled through her husband initially, and later through her son, always within the constraints of traditional femininity. Catherine was different. She took power through a coup. She never remarried. She took lovers openly and made them part of her government. She led armies, conducted diplomacy, made war and peace on her own authority. She did not pretend to be a man, but she also did not limit herself to traditionally female roles. She carved out a new space, the female autocrat who governed as powerfully as any king. And critically, she understood something that many rulers, male or female, fail to grasp. Legitimacy is not given. It is created. She was not the rightful heir by any traditional standard. She was a foreign-born coup leader. So she created legitimacy through accomplishment, through expanding the empire, through cultural patronage, through projecting an image of enlightened governance, through winning wars and building alliances. She made herself indispensable, and indispensability is a form of legitimacy. But here is the shadow side. Catherine's success entrenched Russian autocracy for another century. She proved that absolute monarchy could work, that one brilliant autocrat could govern effectively, and that became the model for future Russian emperors. Her grandson, Alexander the Firm, tried some reforms, but ultimately maintained autocratic control. Nicholas III was brutally repressive. Alexander II freed the serfs in 1861, but was assassinated by revolutionaries. Alexander III reversed reforms. Nicholas II's incompetence led directly to the Russian Revolution. The thread connecting them all was the belief that Russia needed a strong autocrat, that democratic reforms would lead to chaos, that the people were not ready for self-governance. These were the same arguments Catherine made. And because she had been successful with that model, it legitimized autocracy for generations after her. So we have to ask, did Catherine's success doom Russia to autocracy? If she had implemented real democratic reforms, if she had limited her own power, if she had created institutional checks and balances, would Russian history have been different? Would Russia have avoided the catastrophic violence of the 20th century? We cannot know. We cannot play alternate history. But we can recognize that Catherine's choices had consequences that lasted far beyond her lifetime. The system she strengthened, autocratic rule backed by a noble elite oppressing a massive peasant class, that system persisted until it exploded in revolution and millions of people suffered because of it. Yet, here is what complicates the simple narratives. Catherine was probably right that rapid democratic reform in 1760s Russia would have failed. The nobles would have revolted. The country might have descended into civil war. Maybe gradual reform was the only viable path. Maybe she did the best that could be done given the constraints she faced. Or maybe that is just another excuse. Maybe truly great leaders find ways to change systems, not just succeed within them. Maybe Catherine's genius was also her limitation. She was brilliant at wielding power, but could not imagine a world where power was shared. So what can modern leaders learn from Catherine? Several things, I think. First, patience is a strategy. Catherine spent 18 years preparing before she took power. 18 years of learning, building relationships, positioning herself. In our world of instant gratification, that kind of long-term planning seems almost alien, but it works. Strategic patience combined with readiness to act when the moment comes is enormously powerful. Second, legitimacy is constructed. Catherine had no traditional claim to power. So she built legitimacy through accomplishments and image management. Modern leaders do this constantly, whether in politics, business, or any field where authority must be earned rather than inherited. The specific tactics change, but the principle remains. Third, complexity matters. Catherine was not simply good or evil, progressive or reactionary. She was all of those things in different contexts, and understanding the complexity helps us avoid simplistic narratives about our own leaders and situations. The world is messy. Leadership is messy. Simple stories are usually wrong. Fourth, the personal and political are inseparable. Catherine's lovers were also political allies. Her cultural interests served political purposes. Her image management was governance. We like to think we can separate these spheres, but we cannot. And pretending otherwise just makes us naive about how power actually works. And fifth, perhaps most importantly, legacy is not just what you intend. It is what actually results. Catherine intended to be an enlightened ruler. She succeeded in being a powerful one. Those are not the same thing. What we mean to do matters less than what we actually accomplish and what consequences flow from our choices. So, here is my final assessment of Catherine the Great. She was great at accumulating and wielding power. She was great at territorial expansion. She was great at cultural patronage. She was great at political strategy. But she was not great at creating a just society. She was not great at limiting her own power for the benefit of others. She was not great at closing the gap between her ideals and her actions. Does that make her great or not? I think it makes her human brilliantly, consequentially, frustratingly human. She achieved things that seemed impossible for a poor German princess. She transformed Russia into a major power. She left a cultural legacy that endures. But she also strengthened systems of oppression. She chose power over principle when they conflicted. She caused suffering through her choices and her failures to act. We can acknowledge both. We can say she accomplished extraordinary things, and she failed morally in crucial ways. We can appreciate her intelligence while condemning her cruelty. We can learn from her strategic brilliance while rejecting her ethical compromises. Historical figures do not have to be heroes or villains. They can be complex, contradictory, deeply flawed people who nevertheless shaped the world. And Catherine shaped the world. For better and worse, in ways intended and unintended, she left a mark that we are still living with. Russian history cannot be understood without her. European history cannot be told without acknowledging her role and the questions her reign raises about power and principle, about ends and means, about what we sacrifice for success. Those questions are timeless. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. A 15-year-old girl arrived in a foreign country, barely speaking the language, married to a man who despised her with no power and no prospects. And through patience, intelligence, ruthlessness, and will, she became one of the most powerful rulers in the world. That transformation is remarkable. Regardless of how we judge the results, the fact that it was possible at all tells us something profound about human capability and human complexity. We are capable of extraordinary things. We are capable of terrible things. Often, we are capable of both at the same time. And we have choices about which capabilities we develop, which ambitions we pursue, which legacies we leave. Catherine made her choices. History has judged them and will continue to judge them. But understanding her story, really understanding it with all its darkness and light, helps us understand our own potential and our own responsibilities. Because power is not inherently good or evil. It is a tool. And the question is always, what do you do with it? Do you use it to free people or to oppress them, to build or to destroy, to close gaps or to widen them? Catherine had more power than almost anyone in her time, and she used it in ways that were both extraordinary and troubling. She could have done more good. She chose not to, and that choice echoes through history. But she also could have done much worse. She could have been a tyrant like Ivan the Terrible. She could have been weak and incompetent like Peter III. She could have squandered opportunities and let Russia decline. She did not. She was effective, capable, and in her own way, transformational. That counts for something, even if it does not excuse everything. So here's my question for you as we close. What would you have done in Catherine's position? When faced with the choice between ideals and power, which would you choose? When confronted with the system you could not change without losing everything, would you work within it or against it? These are not hypothetical questions. We all face versions of them in our own lives at our own scales. And Catherine's story is ultimately about the fact that these questions do not have easy answers. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the hidden reign of Catherine the Great, for sitting with the complexity and the contradictions, for being willing to see her as she really was. Not the myth, not the scandal, but the flawed, brilliant, ruthless, accomplished human being who shaped history through force of will and strategic genius. I hope her story has given you something to think about, some perspective on power and leadership, some questions about your own choices and values. And I hope you will come back for our next story, because history is full of people like Catherine, complex figures who challenge our assumptions and force us to think more deeply about what greatness really means. Until then, sleep well, dream of empires and revolutions, and remember the stories they never taught you in school are often the ones most worth knowing. Good night.